Hey there folks, welcome back to Unconditional Love Videos, the channel where we explore the heart's deepest and most powerful emotions. Today, a heart-wrenching tale spans continents and time, set in the 18th century. Get ready to embark on a journey of love, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds that transcend societal norms. In the heart of this ship, amidst the bustling passengers, a young man in his mid-20s named Edward is on his way home to London. He's been seeking his fortune in the Americas after being told by his father to make his own way in life and not rely on the family fortune. Edward's father is Sir Arthur Lowings, an industrialist, botanist, and a Member of Parliament for London West. Sir Arthur made his fortune in trading in gold and diamonds. He inherited the mines after his father died. He sold the mines and used the money to open doors to become a Member of Parliament. Edward was the youngest son. He had an elder brother, and so was not considered to inherit the family coal and ore mining business when his father died. In the days that followed the voyage, Edward noticed a young woman who was always at an older woman's side, escorting her to the dining room. It was obvious to Edward that the young woman was the older woman's companion. During the early days of the voyage, Edward would busy himself with his ledgers and planning his next adventure. But every now and then, his mind would drift thinking of the young woman in the dining room, and how he imagined a life with her beside him. Edward had no idea that love was knocking on the door of his heart. It was 12:30 in the afternoon, and for the first time in a few days, Edward decided to go to lunch. As he sat down at his table, he heard the older woman say, "Isabella." He looked up and noticed the young woman looking at him. He could have sworn Isabella had a faint smile on her face when she saw him. It was then that their eyes locked, and in that moment, their destinies became entwined. After lunch was finished, Isabella and her companion left the room to take the sea air before resting in their cabin. Edward was writing in his journal when Isabella returned for her companion's shawl. In an instant, and without thinking, Edward quickly wrote on a piece of paper. Edward passed the note to her as he made his way out of the dining room. Isabella was surprised by the sudden way Edward left the room, but her look changed from surprise to curiosity when she looked at the note in her hand. Her head was spinning with so many questions as to what was on the note. Her heart was pounding as she slowly opened it and began to read. She felt giddy with excitement and curious at the same time as to what Edward had to say, because the note just said, "Need to talk urgent. Meet me tonight on the port deck at 11 p.m. tonight." Edward and Isabella lived in a world where society ruled what was normal and what was not. But the heart sees nothing, only what it wants and needs, love that is real. That night, Isabella made her way to the portside deck. In the moonlight, Isabella could see the silhouette of Edward pacing up and down. She could see he was nervous. As she approached, he suddenly turned to face her, which startled Isabella. Nervously, Edward began to speak. "Thank you for meeting me. I was not sure if you would come, but I am very happy you're here, and I had the courage to give you the note. Isabella stopped Edward mid-sentence and asked, "What is this all about, and why at this hour?" Edward began to feel a little embarrassed at the question, but then he found the courage to say what was on his mind. "Isabella, my name is Edward Lowings. I am returning home to London after spending 6 years in the Americas. I thought this was going to be a long and uninteresting voyage until I saw you. I felt drawn to you, as if my heart was pulling me to you." Before Edward could say another word, Isabella replied, "I have seen you many times in the dining room or on deck and the tea room. It was Lady Margaret who told me about you and has been trying to push me to talk to you. My lady is cunning when it comes to matters of the heart. She knew I liked you, and at lunch when I was too shy to say anything. That is the reason why Lady Margaret said my name, so you could hear. And now here we are." Edward and Isabella spent most of the night talking, getting to know each other, and talking about each other's life and feelings. This was the start of a bond of love that neither of them could have known just how powerful and true their love would be. A few days later, Edward received an invitation to sit at the captain's table for dinner that night. As there were a few hours until then, Edward decided to invite Lady Margaret and Isabella for lunch at his table. He made sure that he found out what they both liked to eat by asking the head waiter, At the stroke of 12:30, Lady Margaret and Isabella walk into the room. Edward rises from his chair to greet them, and he soon finds out Lady Margaret has a sense of humour as he holds the chair for her to sit down. She turned and looked at Edward and said, "What has taken you so long to invite us to your table, Mr. Lowings?" Feeling a little embarrassed, Edward was about to speak when both Lady Margaret and Isabella began to laugh. "Don't mind me, young man, I was only teasing you." Feeling relieved, Edward started to relax more. After a very successful lunch together, they all went to the lounge for coffee. It was then that Edward realized Lady Margaret knew about the secret meetings and the notes passing from Isabella and Edward for the last week or more. Edward could not hold back any longer and told Lady Margaret of his unconditional love for Isabella. He wanted to make her his wife. Lady Margaret was Isabella's guardian and gave her blessing for the marriage. Since she already knew of Isabella's feelings for Edward, it was an easy decision to make, for she could see how happy Edward made Isabella. That evening, as Edward was making his way to the dining room, he was met by the captain and the captain's steward. "A beautiful night for a dinner under the stars, don't you think, Mr. Lowings?" asked the captain. "It most certainly is, sir, and one I have been looking forward to," said Edward. They made their way to the dining room. Edward noticed the table and could see 12 places set for 11 guests. Edward knew most of the guests on the ship, so conversation was not an issue. After the small talk, everyone made their way to the captain's table. Edward was about to sit at the table when Lady Margaret and Isabella walked in and made their way to the table. It was then that Edward noticed the chairs each side of him were empty. Lady Margaret would be sitting on his left next to the captain and Isabella on his right. After dinner, there were the usual activities. Some of the men retired to the smoking room for a brandy and a cigar, while some women went to what some call the gossip room. Edward sat with Lady Margaret, Isabella and the captain drinking tea and having a general conversation, when suddenly Lady Margaret told the captain that Isabella and Edward were to be married. The captain looked surprised and delighted at the same time, and then asked had a date been set for the wedding yet, to which all three said at the same time, "No." The captain sat back and smiled, looked at Edward and said, "Mr. Lowings, is your father still a politician?" To which Edward said yes. The captain leaned forward in his chair and said softly, "Well, your father and I go back a long way. If there's one thing that I know about your father, he hates not being in control. That's why he became a politician, to control others. Lady Margaret, it would be a great honor to perform the marriage here on the ship in my capacity as captain before I retire at the end of this voyage." Isabella looked down shyly but with a faint smile, for in her mind, Lady Margaret knew what she was doing by telling the captain about the marriage and knew the captain would offer to marry them on the ship. The wedding was set for tomorrow at noon, but Isabella was busy all through the night, preparing for her wedding to the man she was deeply in love with. Edward was busy also sorting out something decent to wear after living in the jungle for the last few years. The sun started to break through the darkness of the night, revealing a new day and a new life for some. It was noon, and time for Edward and Isabella to become one, to start a new life together. After the vows had been done, it was time to celebrate, and what better way than on a ship in the middle of the sea on a beautiful sunny day. The next few days were like a fairy tale for Edward and Isabella, with so many plans for the future and their life together. They arrived at Southampton early Friday morning. Edward was going to London to greet his father, and he had some business in London he had to attend to, while Isabella would go with Lady Margaret to the house in Surrey, where Edward will join them in a few days' time. Edward and Isabella are deeply in love, and that love is an unbreakable bond, soon to show that the bond is just that, unbreakable. Edward stepped off the train, collected his luggage, and made his way to the hackney carriage waiting outside the station. "Where to, Governor?" asked the cab driver. "Bond Street, if you will, driver." Edward felt strange being back in London after years of living in the jungle. He had forgotten what it was like to see so many people going about their business and not hunting for food. It was not long before they got to Bond Street. Edward handed the driver some money. "Thank you, Governor. You have yourself a prosperous day," said the cab driver. Edward turned and looked up and down Bond Street. He saw what he was looking for and proceeded to walk into the property. Later that day, Lady Margaret and Isabella arrived at Oakfield Manor. Lady Margaret retired to her rooms, while Isabella gave instructions to the footman and stable hands as to where each piece of luggage should go. Isabella made her way to what would be her and Edward's rooms, and started to get busy taking the covers off the furniture, ready to prepare for Edward's arrival in 2 weeks from now. It was early evening when Edward arrived at his father's house in Mayfair. The doorman greeted Edward like an old friend. "It's good to see you back with us once more, sir. It has not been the same since you left." "Thank you, George. How is the family?" asked Edward. "Everyone is fine, sir, thanks to you and your generosity over the last 2 years." "Think nothing of it, my friend. You have always been like a father to me from a young age. It was the least I could do once I heard about young Richard. Very sad news it was indeed," said Edward. "Aye, that it was. It almost broke his mother until your telegram arrived with the promise of help from the bank," said George, as he wiped a tear from his eye. "Don't stress yourself, George. I have always considered you all as my other family." "No, sir, and thank you, sir," said George. "Your father is in the study reading the evening paper." "Thank you," said Edward, as he made his way to the study. Lady Margaret and Isabella were having a light but late supper in the parlour and were planning to have the wedding blessed in the local church when Edward arrived. "Tomorrow I will travel to London to seek counsel with my attorney," said Lady Margaret. "I will prepare your things for the journey and refreshments for us," said Isabella. "I shall travel alone," said Lady Margaret. "I will have Master John with me to carry anything heavy or defend my honour." With that, Lady Margaret burst out laughing, and then Isabella started to laugh with her. "As if my honour needs defending. Chance would be a fine thing." This made Lady Margaret laugh even more. "My lady, you shouldn't say such things. Someone may hear you." "Oh, let them. I'm only having a bit of fun." As Edward walked into the study, he saw the familiar surroundings of books on many shelves, none of which his father had read. It was all just for show, to make everyone think he studies when he's not in Parliament. There was an oversized painting of his father over the mantelpiece, and another painting of his father and Edward's older brother on a boat with Parliament in the background. Nothing had changed in almost 7 years, thought Edward. Just then his father said, "Well, did you make your fortune in the Americas? I heard you found gold and set up a mine. What about the lost city of gold? Did you go and look for it?" Edward was not surprised. His father was more interested in wealth than asking how Edward was. "I have made enough to be comfortable," said Edward. "Nonsense," said his father. "You can never make enough money." "That's just your saying, father," said Edward. Just then Edward's brother Charlie walked in and was surprised to see his younger brother. "When did you get back? How have you been? What adventures have you got to tell me? Did you find what you went for?" Edward bursts out laughing. "Trust you to want to know everything in one go? I will tell you everything over dinner tonight." Edward's father interrupts the conversation and says, "Well, it will just be you two for dinner. I have important business at the club this evening." With that, his father left the room. The next day, Lady Margaret's carriage was waiting outside the main entrance. John was waiting by the carriage, having stored Lady Margaret's document box and lunch basket. John helped Lady Margaret into the carriage, then climbed up front to sit with the driver. Isabella saw them off and returned to the house to prepare for tonight's dinner party. Lady Margaret always liked to have a dinner party as soon as possible, whenever she returned to the house. It was her way of catching up on all the latest local news, or to put it another way, all the gossip. Edward had been awake most of the night and early morning talking to his brother, talking about his adventures in South America. Edward's brother was fascinated hearing about his younger brother's adventures and was keen to try it himself, but in reality knows that his father would not allow it. At breakfast, Edward and his brother were talking about the day's plans when their father walked in, sat down at the head of the table and began to select his breakfast. It was only after he poured his tea. He looked up to speak to Edward, but with slight anger in his voice. "Well, Edward, it seems you made a name for yourself out in the Americas. You were the talk of the club last night. It seems you neglected to tell me a few things about the gold mine and the export of coffee to America and Britain." "Well, maybe if you had a proper conversation with me last night, you would have," snapped Edward. That seemed to put Edward's father in a mood, but it's hard to tell as he is always in a foul mood, unless with his gentlemen's club friends. Edward was about to say something else when the butler arrived with a letter and a telegram. His father snatched them both off the tray the butler was holding and proceeded to read the letter. Edward could see there was an invitation also with the letter, but not who from. His father just smiled, but not in the normal good smile. It was the smile of someone who has hatched a plan. He then said, "Ah, so she is back at last." Edward's father then started to read the telegram, when suddenly he jumped up, banging his hand down on the table, and in a loud, booming voice, "Yes, I knew it. I knew I did the right move. Now all that is left to do is the meeting." Edward's father then sat down and seemed to be in a good mood. The brothers looked at each other and said quietly, "Trouble."
Set my world on fire. I just wanna love you, just wanna hold you, just wanna be with you till we grow old.
Welcome everyone to the continuation of our story, Unbreakable Bond, Episode 2, Love, Family and Betrayal. Lady Margaret returned to Oakfield late in the afternoon and found everything Isabella had prepared for the dinner party that evening. Lady Margaret was about to retire to her room and rest before dinner when Isabella asked about the trip to London. "Very positive and very informative trip. The lawyer had everything ready for me," said Lady Margaret. "Wake me in 2 hours, please, Isabella. I need to talk with you before our guests arrive at 7:30 this evening." Lady Margaret then turned and entered her room. Meanwhile, back in London, Edward was spending the day with his brother Charlie. They decided to go for a stroll in Hyde Park. After walking for a while, they stopped and sat down at a bench under a large tree. It was then that Charlie asked what was on Edward's mind, as he knew his younger brother very well. Edward began to tell Charlie about the gold mine and coffee trade and his marriage to Isabella on the voyage back to England. Charlie listened without saying a word until Edward had finished. Charlie took some tobacco from a leather pouch, began to fill his pipe, and without looking at his brother said, "So, little brother, you're now married. It must be real, for I have never known you to do anything without thinking it out first. But one question I have to ask you. Edward, how did you know Isabella was the one?" Edward turned to his brother and said, "Of all the women I have seen on my travels, not one has made my heart feel so full of love and happiness just by being in the same room as them. I saw in Isabella something very special and genuine. But why so fast in getting married after only a few days?" asked Charlie. This made Edward laugh and say, "What happened to the one question?" "Well, at the time after it was mentioned to the captain by Lady Margaret that Isabella and I were to be married, he suggested he marry us on the ship. The captain knows father very well and told me how father can be very controlling of people," Charlie remarked. "The captain does know father well." "Exactly," said Edward. "And I thought, why should we wait to be married in England when it can be done on the ship?" It was then Charlie asked, "When will you tell father about Isabella?" Edward looked Charlie in the eye and said in a slightly angry tone, "Why, he has never shown any interest in anything I have ever done since mother died when I was 4 years old." Charlie said, "Your lucky father hasn't prearranged someone from a wealthy family from here or Europe to marry you." To boost his wealth and power in being the biggest landowner in London, as he did with me, Edward put his hand on Charlie's shoulder and said, "But brother, you have a wonderful loving wife who has given you nothing but loyalty with her love for you." "I know," said Charlie. Isabella entered Lady Margaret's room to awaken her from her rest, only to find Lady Margaret sitting at her writing desk reading some documents. "My lady, did you not rest?" asked Isabella. "Yes, I did have some rest, but I needed to attend to a few things before the day was over." "Please sit with me, Isabella. I have something I need to give you and a few things to tell you." Isabella sat next to Lady Margaret. "Now, ever since I became your guardian from the day you were born, you have become not just my companion, but like my own daughter. I want you to have this ring. It belonged to my brother who died in the war in the Gold Coast. But promise me you will not wear it until the day of my funeral." "But why?" asked Isabella. "You will understand everything after I am gone," said Lady Margaret. "So until then, keep the ring safe, and also these documents. Do not mention the ring or show the documents to anyone. Only Edward may know, for he is the very embodiment of my brother, and I trusted my brother completely, which is why I trust Edward." Isabella agreed to Lady Margaret's request and proceeded to leave the room and to place the ring and documents in a safe place in her own room. Lady Margaret greeted her guests with a warm welcome, which always made her guests feel good to be invited. There was a quartet playing in the next room, with a few guests sitting and listening to the music of Handel. The butler entered the room to inform Lady Margaret that Lord Peterson had arrived and had brought a guest with him. Lady Margaret thanked the butler and proceeded to greet them both. "Good evening, my dear Lady Margaret. I hope you don't mind. I have brought my good friend along, Sir Arthur Lowings." "Not at all," said Lady Margaret politely. "Sir Arthur and I are acquainted with each other." "Welcome to Oakfield Manor, Sir Arthur. Please come and join the others." "Thank you for allowing me to enjoy your famous hospitality, Lady Margaret," replied Sir Arthur. All three then proceeded to enter the main room. That evening, Edward and Charlie were sitting at the dinner table, talking freely to each other since their father was away from London for a few days. "So, Edward, tell me, how did you manage the export of the coffee from Colombia?" "I made a deal with Núñez, the new party leader. The deal is for me to take 30% from the profit of the gold mine, with 70% going to the new government, but on condition that I was allowed a 30-year mandate to export coffee, 1 year for each percent from the gold mine deal," explained Edward. He then went on to say, "One thing father's friends at the club do not know. I now have a deal with Germany and Italy to supply coffee after meeting both countries' diplomats at one of Núñez's dinner parties." "That's amazing," said Charlie. "You always had a good business mind from a young age, Edward." "I am still concerned about the marriage and father," said Charlie. "Don't let it worry you, brother. Once I have finished with my business here in London, I will set up my new life with Isabella away from father and his controlling ways." The two brothers then began to reminisce about their childhood and the happy times they had when their mother was alive. After dinner, everyone was relaxing. Some were playing bridge and others just sitting and chatting. Sir Arthur approached Lady Margaret, who was on the balcony taking the night's cool air. "Lady Margaret, have you given any more thought to my proposal to buy the land in Norfolk?" "My mind hasn't changed. The thought of destroying that beautiful land to dig for sand and stone, just for you and your friends to profit from others' suffering, by removing 2 villages in doing so, goes against all my brother held dear to his heart," replied Lady Margaret. This made Sir Arthur angry inside, but he did not let it show. He just replied, "Very well, as you wish, but there will come a time you will accept my offer." Sir Arthur returned to join Lord Peterson, but his lordship was busy talking to the Lady Sarah. Sir Arthur sat by the fire and drank a few glasses of whisky, which only made his mind turn to more anger. He then got up and went into the hallway and decided to go to Lady Margaret's study. Once inside, Sir Arthur started to look through the desk drawers and ledgers. He was looking for anything that could help get that land. A few moments later, Isabella entered the room and was shocked to see a gentleman frantically looking through Lady Margaret's paperwork. "Who are you? And why are you here in Lady Margaret's study?" shouted Isabella. "Be very careful who are talking to. No servant should raise their voice to someone of breeding and stature, especially a servant of colour. Know your place." Before Isabella could open the door to leave, Sir Arthur was holding her arm, pulling her to him. He tried to kiss Isabella, but as soon as she turned her head, she was struck hard across the face. She felt herself being thrown to the floor, hitting her head on the desk. Isabella must have passed out, for when she awoke, Master John was carrying her to her room. Isabella asked, "What happened, Master John?" "I heard shouting from the study and found you on the floor." John placed Isabella on her bed and said, "I will fetch Lady Margaret." "No, I will be all right. I must have fainted from not eating much while preparing for tonight's dinner party," said Isabella. John noticed the marks on Isabella's face. "Miss Isabella, fainting does not give you bruising the size of a man's hand on your face." "Bruising? Please pass me a mirror." Isabella looked at the marks on her face. She had no idea how they got there. The next day, Isabella made herself presentable, hiding the bruising on her face. Lady Margaret was already sitting at the breakfast table when Isabella entered the room. "There you are, my dear. Have something to eat before it gets cold." It was a very successful night. I managed to get all the gossip while I was away. Isabella was just picking at the food on her plate when Lady Margaret said, "Are you not feeling well this morning?" "It will pass. I just seem to have a headache this morning," said Isabella. "Then I will have Master John prepare a herbal remedy for you. His knowledge of nature's medicine is well known." Isabella asked if she may be excused from the table as she needed to lay down. As Isabella stood up, she fell to the floor. Never underestimate the power of true love. It will overcome all things when it comes to the heart.
You make me smile, what is it that you do? My life was great.
Isabella awoke to find Lady Margaret and Dr. Simons from the village standing by her bed, talking in a low voice. "Ah, you are awake, young lady," said the doctor. "I advise you to spend the rest of the day in bed." "Thank you, Dr. Simons," said Lady Margaret. "Now, Isabella, will you explain why your face has bruising and also why you have a deep cut on your head?" Isabella looked at Lady Margaret with a confused look on her face. "I remember going into the study to pull the drapes across the windows, and the next thing I remember, Master John carrying me to my room. I think I was feeling tired after preparing for the dinner party." Lady Margaret looked at Isabella and gave a smile. "Well, as long as you try to be more careful in the future." Isabella suddenly remembered a guest who she had never seen before. Who was the gentleman wearing a white summer dinner jacket? Lady Margaret had to think for a moment and said, "Oh, that is a friend of Lord Peterson, Sir Arthur. He is a horrid little man. He only cares about money and power. I was relieved when he left in a hurry last night. I think it was just after 9 when he left." Isabella thought for a moment. It was about 9 o'clock that she went into the study. At that moment, Lady Margaret said, "Isabella, you do know who Sir Arthur is, don't you?" "No, my lady, I have no idea. That poor specimen of a man is your Edward's father." Upon hearing that, Isabella felt sick, but not sick as going to throw up, but a sick pain in her heart. She felt like her heart was going to explode. Isabella could not understand why she felt like that, or why. Lady Margaret then said, "Edward and his brother Charlie take after their mother, the kindest woman I have ever known, and very, very smart when it comes to money and people. It was a shock to everyone when she took her own life by jumping into the River Thames one Christmas night all those years ago. I believe Edward was about 4 at that time." Isabella asked Lady Margaret, "May I rest now as I am feeling very tired?" "Of course, my dear. You rest. I will send Mary from the kitchen with some tea later." With that, Lady Margaret left the room. Master John went into the village that morning to speak with his friend who works on Lord Peterson's estate. "Morning, Jack." A man in his 50s turned round. "Well, knock me down with a feather. What brings you to the village at this time of day?" asked Jack. "I came to see you and to have a word about a guest staying with Lord Peterson." "Do you mean that Lowing's chap from London?" "Yes, my friend. I need to know if you heard anything about Lady Margaret's dinner party last night." Jack thought for a moment and said, "Yes, there was something. Maggie the parlour maid overheard that Lowing's fella talking to his lordship in the breakfast room about a servant who forgot her place and raised her voice to him last night, and he had to teach her to know her place in the world. Maggie said all she could hear after that was the servant tripped when Lowings tried to grab her arm, and she fell hitting her head on the edge of a desk or something. Maggie did say that his lordship said to that Lowings chap, 'Not to worry, old boy. It's the word a common maid against yours, a distinguished member of Parliament. No one will believe her lies.' Thank you, Jack. Glad I was able to help, but why have you an interest in the affairs of the high-ups?" "I just wanted to find out what happened to put my mind to rest," said John. "See you Friday, Jack. First 2 drinks are on me." "I will hold you to that, my friend. By the way, John, how long have you had a maid from the tropics at the house?" John carried on walking, pretending he didn't hear the question. But under his breath, and with gritted teeth, he said, in a whisper, "We haven't." A few days later, Sir Arthur asked Charlie to arrange a dinner at the Grosvenor Hotel with a table for 16. "I will need to know who is going, so the hotel can arrange any special requirements that may be needed," asked Charlie. "The list is on my desk. Pick it up on your way out." Within 20 minutes, Charlie had left the house to go to the hotel. Edward left early in the morning to conclude his business, and this left Sir Arthur alone in the house, which was Sir Arthur's plan all along. He proceeded to go into Edward's room and search through any paperwork he could find. After 10 minutes, Sir Arthur found nothing of interest until he saw a small case on top of the wardrobe. Pulling it down, he quickly opened it. He found some documents in Spanish, but dismissed them as not important. Then he found a letter from the Bank of England. Upon reading it, he had all the information he needed. Later that morning, Sir Arthur was meeting with the directors of the bank. All were from his gentleman's club, and each knew one another's secrets. So the power of their little society stays strong. The meeting went exactly as Sir Arthur wanted, and now he felt even more secure in his efforts to control people. It is the day of Sir Arthur's dinner. Charlie and his wife will be there with Edward, a few members of Parliament, and Lord and Lady Kemp, Lord Kemp's daughter Lady Beatrice, and his sister Miss Annie and brother Mr. Herbert. Edward returned to the house, but as he was about to enter the door, George the doorman said, "Excuse me, sir, I have a note for you." "Who from?" asked Edward. "The gentleman just told me to tell you, the captain." "Thank you, George." Edward read the note and proceeded to walk to the Fox and Hound Inn. Once inside, Edward didn't have to look for the captain, as he was the only person there. "I took the precaution to ask the landlord to open early so we could talk alone. This sounds all cloak and dagger, Captain. What's going on?" "I'm here to warn you that your father is up to something that could make you lose everything." "I know my father is always up to something no good. It's his way," said Edward. "But how and why are you involved with this captain?" "I was asked to keep an eye on you from your friends in Colombia, and it was those same friends who asked the German diplomat to know every move your father makes." The captain was very serious when he spoke those words. "I don't understand why the government want you to keep an eye on me, and especially my father. I can only tell you this. The Colombian leadership have an interest in you as you have with them, and they want to safeguard that interest." "I think I understand now," said Edward. "Now listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you." Edward listened to the captain talk for over an hour, taking in every word said. At the hotel, everyone was gathered in the large banquet hall. Edward said to his brother, "What is the occasion for Charlie?" To which Charlie just shrugged his shoulders and said, "Not a clue, Edward. I just follow orders." The head waiter sounded the bell for everyone to sit at the table. After a few moments, the food was served, and it was almost 2 hours before everyone had finished eating. It was time for coffee and brandy. When the coffee arrived, Sir Arthur took a sip of coffee and said in a loud voice, "This could be the very same coffee Edward has exported to Britain from Colombia." "Is this true, Edward?" said Lord Kemp. "You export coffee to Britain from Colombia?" "And to America," said Edward's father. "Tell Lord Kemp about the gold mine in Colombia." "Gold mine as well. You have been busy making your fortune," said Lord Kemp. With that, he stood up to make a toast. "It is with great pride that I give my blessing to the engagement of my only daughter Beatrice to Edward Lowings." It took a few moments for Edward to realize what was happening, but it only took him a few seconds to stand up and say to everyone at the table, "I have no intention of marrying someone I have never met, or even spoken to, whatever twisted idea you are plotting, father. Forget it. I will not be part of your twisted plans to make you more powerful and richer." Edward turned and started to walk away. "Sir Arthur," shouted Lord Kemp, "you promised me your son would marry my daughter and we both will benefit from the marriage." Sir Arthur said in a loud voice, "Edward, once you walk out of that door, you are no longer part of the family. You will no longer be welcomed in the family home, and you will no longer have the protection of the British government wherever you go." Edward just continued walking. It did not take long for Edward to collect his things and stay at the guest house near the train station for the night. The next morning, Edward arrived at Oakfield Manor. The footman walked Edward to wait in the study, and then went to fetch Lady Margaret. "Edward, you're here early. What an unexpected and pleasant surprise," said Lady Margaret. "Isabella is in the garden by the willow trees." Edward did not waste time. He rushed out of the house and into the garden. He was almost tripping over his own feet. He was in such a hurry to see Isabella. Edward stopped and just looked at Isabella sitting under the tree, thinking how beautiful she looked and how lucky he was. Isabella did not see Edward standing there, so Edward walked slowly up to Isabella and said softly, "May I join you?" To which Isabella looked up and gave a happy, surprised type of scream. She jumped up and held Edward so tight he felt as if a great grizzly bear was hugging him. "You seem happy to see me, my love," joked Edward. "I'm so happy to have you with me again, my husband." After a few minutes, they both went for a walk in the garden, and they made their way to the house. Lady Margaret was sitting on the lawn with a picnic laid out. "Come and join me. I have cake," said Lady Margaret, laughing. Edward and Isabella sat down with Lady Margaret. It felt like being at lunch together on the ship, and it felt good. It was late afternoon when a telegram arrived for Edward. It only had a few words in Latin. "Al bellum incepit perdere vos omnes," meaning, "AL has started a war to destroy you all."
I just wanna love you, just wanna hold you, just wanna be with you till we grow old. Please tell me you'll stay. I just wanna love you, just wanna hold you, just wanna be with you till we grow old. Please tell me.
Welcome everyone to the continuation of our story, Unbreakable Bond, Episode 3, Blinded by Power and Greed. It has been almost 2 months since Edward arrived back in England, and in that time, Edward's father's real intentions came out. He wanted to control not only Edward's brother Charlie's life, but Edward's as well. Unknown to Sir Arthur, Edward is more than just the youngest son of a powerful and corrupt politician. Edward in his own right has political power behind him as well. It may not be English political power, but it is still power all the same. But in the Victorian world where money means nothing without power, Edward knows he has to be completely free of his father's reach and his political power. Lady Margaret received an invitation to a garden party at Lord Peterson's home in 2 days. It was something she enjoyed and looked forward to every year, as Lord Peterson's garden was one of the most beautiful gardens in the district. Isabella was sitting in the parlour reading a few documents for Edward's new export order for coffee to Italy and Germany when Lady Margaret entered the room. "Would you like to accompany me to a garden party at Lord Peterson's home on Wednesday?" asked Lady Margaret. "Yes, please," replied Isabella. "Any excuse to walk in that paradise of a garden?" "I wish Edward was here to join us," said Isabella. "Yes, we both do, but he did have to travel to Lloyd's in London to have the ships and their cargo insured before travelling to Italy and prepare the manifest of the cargo going to Colombia as required, in exchange for the coffee on the return trip back to Italy," explained Lady Margaret. "My Edward likes to make sure everything is in place and runs smoothly. That's his way. And as Edward has said before, never leave an important job to those who know nothing or care when others can lose everything." Later that day, Lady Margaret was about to go walk into the garden when she noticed someone walking on the path towards her. At first, Lady Margaret could not see who it was, as the sunlight was in her eyes, but as soon as the lonely figure spoke, "Good afternoon, Lady Margaret," she knew who it was straight away. "My dear Captain, what brings you to Oakfield?" "Master Edward asked me to collect a few documents and a notebook," Edward said. "Isabella would know which ones I needed. It also gave me an opportunity to talk with Master John about some herbal remedies for my stomach." "I remember you talking about the wonder of herbal healing in the hands of Master John," said the captain. "He is the best person to see regarding herbal for the body and mind." "Have you time to walk with me in the garden, Captain?" asked Lady Margaret. "It would be my pleasure to escort you into such a wonderful garden on a perfect summer afternoon," replied the captain. Edward had concluded his business with Lloyd's and sent a note to Charlie to meet with him in Hyde Park before Edward travelled to Southampton to board a ship bound for Italy. It was midday when Charlie met Edward. "Edward, I'm glad I have the chance to talk with you. Father has turned into someone I no longer recognise. He is so full of hate for you and Lady Margaret," said Charlie in a panicking voice. "Hate is a strong word, brother. But it's true, Edward. He cannot forgive you for turning down the chance to marry Lord Kemp's daughter, and any chance of father had to join the Freemasons using Lord Kemp and his friends. And as for Lady Margaret, after her brother died and left the estate in Norfolk to her, and since Lady Margaret has turned down many offers to sell the land to father, that has put him in a bad situation with those in power who invested a lot of money in the prospect of making a fortune from digging sand and stone from that land. Well, you know the real reason I would not entertain marrying someone else, especially when it had something to do with father," said Edward. "I am just glad father does not know about you being married to Isabella. I dread to think what he would be like once he finds out." "I'm sorry, brother, but father can burn in hell for all I care," said Edward with a harsh tone. "And I am sorry you are stuck with him." "Not for long, brother." "What do you mean?" asked Edward. "I spoke to my wife a few weeks ago about how bad things are here with father, and so she spoke with her father. So now we, or I should say, I have been given the chance to be the voice of her father, Lord Wilkes, in Hong Kong on matters of trade," said Charlie. "Well, that is going to hit father hard, not having you to do the mundane work for him anymore." "Well done, brother. I am very happy for you. I take it that Katie and your 2 daughters will go with you." "Indeed they will, Edward. The feeling of having this heavy weight lifted off my shoulders feels incredible," said Charlie. After an hour, the brothers said their goodbyes and made a promise to meet again in Hyde Park 1 year from today. At Oak Field, Lady Margaret and the captain returned to the house after a nice leisurely walk in the garden. "Please stay a day or 2, Captain. It will be nice to hear about your adventures at sea." "It would be very nice to enjoy the comfort of your beautiful home, Lady Margaret, but I must return to London tomorrow." "Well, at least stay the night for dinner and entertain Isabella and myself with your adventures as payment for your meal," laughed Lady Margaret. This made the captain bust out laughing. "Aye, that I will, Lady Margaret. I will throw in a few sea monsters as well to spice up the stories." This made them both laugh out loud as they entered the house. Lady Margaret sent for Master John, and after a few minutes, John entered the room. "Master John, the captain would like to ask you about some herbal remedies for his stomach. I will leave you both to talk. Help yourself to the drinks cabinet. And I will be with Isabella in the parlour and call for you when dinner is ready. Will you join us tonight, Master John?" "Thank you, my lady, I will," said John. Lady Margaret left the 2 men to talk. Isabella was writing a letter to give to the captain for Edward when Lady Margaret walked into the room. "My dear, I was wondering if you could go with John after the garden party and travel to Norfolk to see if everything is going well," asked Lady Margaret. "Yes, of course, it would be nice to visit Miss Anne again. I will take her favourite fruit pie that Mary used to make for her when Miss Anne was my governess," said Isabella in an excited voice. "That is very thoughtful of you, my dear. You always got on so well with Miss Anne. Please take a few books for her as well. You know how she loves to read when eating fruit pie," laughed Lady Margaret. It was the day of Lord Peterson's garden party. Lady Margaret and Isabella were enjoying the garden and stopped for a moment to rest and enjoy the view. Lord Peterson was walking towards them with Lord Kemp. "Good afternoon, Lady Margaret and Miss Isabella. What a beautiful afternoon, and I see you have picked a good spot to rest." "Yes, we both have loved this part of the garden, even since Isabella was very young," said Lady Margaret. "May I introduce Lord Kemp?" said Lord Peterson. "It has been a while since we last met. I believe it was at my brother's memorial," said Lady Margaret. "Yes, it was the last time we met, and it is part of the reason I am here today, Lady Margaret. I have had come into my possession some letters your brother wrote to you when you were in the Caribbean, but he was unable to send." A shocked look came across Lady Margaret's face, then slowly turned into an emotional smile. "Thank you. Thank you. That is so kind of you to bring them for me, Lord Kemp." "How did you come across them after all these years?" asked Lady Margaret. Lord Kemp began to tell Lady Margaret about the time her brother was wounded and was taken to the Campfield Hospital, where Surgeon Major Dr. James Whitman was on duty. Everything Lady Margaret's brother had on him was placed into a box, his uniform and weapon, etc., and a small leather pouch. The pouch was overlooked when Lady Margaret's brother left to recover in Cape Town. Dr. Whitman returned a few weeks after that to England to take up a position as the Inspector General of the hospital's Surgeon General. Where he worked until his death last month, the pouch was found, and as it had the regiment crest, it was then handed to Lord Kemp, as he was the only Brigadier General of the regiment not overseas. Isabella asked Lady Margaret if she would like her to take the pouch to Master John, who was with the horse and carriage by the stables. Lady Margaret agreed. As Isabella left to find Master John, Lord Peterson said, "Isabella has grown into a wonderful young woman. You must be very proud, Lady Margaret." "I am very proud of her in so many ways," said Lady Margaret. "I must ask you, Lady Margaret, how is Mary, Surrey's finest and best cook?" asked Lord Peterson. Cooking perfection every day, especially when baking cakes, laughed Lady Margaret. I meant to ask you, how long have you had a maid at Oakfield from the tropics? Asked Lord Peterson. Lady Margaret gave a puzzled look and said, I have no idea where you heard I have a new maid, and from the Caribbean no less. I am afraid you have been informed wrongly, Lord Peterson. Isabella is the only one born in the Caribbean, and is certainly not a maid, laughed Lady Margaret. At that moment Lord Peterson felt as if his soul was being pulled from his body. He turned pale, and then his face was getting flushed. He realized it was not a maid that Sir Arthur had seen in the study, but Isabella. Please excuse Lord Kemp and myself. There is something urgent I need to talk to my friend about. Yes, of course. I will wait for Isabella to return, and then we can go and have fun getting lost in the garden maze, said Lady Margaret. When you let others control your life, that's when you realize you have no life to call your own.
You set my world on fire.
Meanwhile, back in London, Sir Arthur has been busy entertaining his friends from Parliament and the bank. He had also been to a few disreputable places where only the corrupt would dare go. Charlie had noticed a very dark change in his father, and this had made up his mind to leave London for Hong Kong when his father had left for his trip to Norfolk. Sir Arthur had been busy with sending messages to Colombia and America, and now is more than ever determined to have complete control. Sir Arthur said in a loud, angry voice to Charlie, Your brother is mistaken if he thinks he can just walk out of the future I have planned for him. Talking to himself, Charlie said in a low voice, You mean your future. I will soon have Edward back on the path I have made for him, and everything will be as it should. Charlie, take this letter to the landlord of the Merchant's Tavern at the docks, and then go to the Bank of London. A gentleman at the first desk will give you some sealed documents for me. Charlie made his way out of the house. On my way to another fool's errand, for Father George. Be careful, Master Charlie. The Merchant's Tavern is not the best place for a gentleman such as yourself, replied the doorman. Charlie looked surprised and said, How did you know where I am going? Oh, never mind, it does not matter right now. Charlie went across the street and set off for the tavern. Isabella and John arrived at Miss Anne's cottage in the village of Aylsham in Norfolk. The cottage was near the local church and the village green. The door opened as Isabella and John entered the gate when a very excited woman in her 50s came rushing out of the cottage and said in an excited voice, Isabella, you have arrived with perfect timing. I was just about to go into the village for a few things. We would like to accompany you into the village, Miss Anne. May we place our things inside for now? Asked Isabella. Yes, my dear, just leave them inside for now. Master John, it is so nice to see you again. I'm so grateful for the herbal remedy for my knee. I've not had any pain for years now. Apart from old age pains, laughed Miss Anne. In the village, Miss Anne stopped at the bakery for some fresh bread and milk. John waited outside as Isabella and Miss Anne went inside. Well, look who is here with Miss Anne, said a young woman behind the counter. She was talking to someone at the back of the shop. An elderly man came out from the back, put his arms in the air, gave a delighted little laugh, and rushed around the counter. Isabella, you are a sight for sore eyes. Let me look at you. My, you have turned into a fine young lady. It has been a long time since we last saw you. What is it, 9 or 10 years? Hello, Mr. Green. It has been a long time, and if I remember rightly, it was 9 years ago, the last time I was here. It was for Miss Jane's 12th birthday, and we had so much cake I was full for a week, laughed Isabella. How are you, Jane? Asked Isabella to the young woman behind the counter. I am very well, thank you for asking. We must find time to talk more, maybe later today or tomorrow. Master John and I are here for a few days, said Isabella. Master John is here in the village, said Jane in an excited voice, tidying her hair at the same time. Both Miss Anne and Isabella laughed at the way Jane was making herself look presentable, but overlooking the flour on her face. Here, let me wipe the flour from your face, said Isabella. Please do come and join us at the cottage later, both of you, said Miss Anne. Sir Arthur arrived in Norfolk and set off for Aylsham. Once he was there, Sir Arthur met with a few landowners and the vicar from the church. They were having a meeting at Sir Webster's house. Gentlemen, what progress have we made on obtaining the farms and cottages around Lady Margaret's land? Inquired Sir Arthur. "We have acquired almost all the cottages and half the farms," said one landowner called Pete Turnbull, one of the greediest men when it came to money you could ever meet. "We must find a way to get rid of everyone." "Vicar, is there a way the church can make this work?" asked Sir Arthur. "Well, maybe on a few cottages we could persuade some to sell and leave with a bigger offer," said the vicar. He then went on to say, "None that are left have any family." "So if something was to happen, no one will notice," said Sir Arthur. "Now steady on, old chap. We do not want to resort to violence," said Sir Webster. "No one will be hurt unless they are completely stubborn," said Sir Arthur. "The choice is all of them gone, or we all lose making a lot of money in the future." Everyone agreed, and also agreed to let Sir Arthur handle it all from now on. Over the next few days, Isabella and John went to Lady Margaret's brother's land and saw a few empty cottages and farms. But as it is nothing unusual to see such places empty in the countryside, nothing seemed to be wrong. One morning, as John was in the village buying some tobacco, he noticed a gentleman walking across the street. John said to himself, "That's not a good sign." John had seen Sir Arthur. Once John got back to Miss Anne's, he asked Isabella to stay at the cottage until he returned later. Isabella knew that when John asked something like that, it was best to obey. "Very well, Master John. I will wait for your return later today." "Miss Anne, do you know why there are a lot of cottages and a few farms empty?" asked John. "Oh, those on the other side of the river, you mean? Yes, they sold them to that Turnbull chap." "Something to do with the church needing the land, and being the way people in these parts feel obligated to the church, they sold their homes and farms." Isabella and John looked at each other, and both knew there was more to this than meets the eye. While Sir Arthur is away, Charlie, with the help of George the doorman, has removed all of Charlie's, Edward's, and all the personal things that belonged to their mother. Everything has been packed into travelling trunks, ready to set sail with Charlie and his family for their new life in Hong Kong. "Well, this is it, George. I am finally going to be free to live my life as I want." "I wish you all the best, Master Charlie. I am so pleased you are following in Master Edward's footsteps. I never thought this day would ever happen, but Father has never been a father to us, really, even before Mother died." The two men shook hands and said their goodbyes when Charlie stopped and turned around. "George, one question. That time you told me to be careful at the Merchant's Tavern, how did you know I was going there?" George smiled and said years ago when your mother was having building work done on the house, she had an air vent placed in the walls of the study and your father's office. "Was that to keep the air circulating, George?" "No, sir. Your mother never trusted your father, not after he found a way to control her father's money and hers." "So what has the air vents to do with all of this?" asked Charlie. "Stand here, Master Charlie." George then went into the house and then into the study and started to talk to himself. George then stepped outside again. "Well, Master Charlie, I heard every word you said. It was so clear. But how did my mother think of that?" asked Charlie. "It was the idea of your mother's Uncle Karl, the German advisor to the palace." "You mean Uncle Karl, who taught Edward and myself to ride horses?" "Yes, and his son is the German diplomat in Colombia, the very same one helping Edward with the coffee trade to Germany." "But why was it done in the first place?" asked Charlie. "Your Uncle Karl and your mother wanted to find out exactly what your father was planning, as it was strange that he had been trying to get your mother to sign all assets over to the Bank of England for safekeeping. So you have been listening while standing here for years to collect information," said Charlie. "That I have, Master Charlie. After your mother passed away, your Uncle Karl asked me to be even more vigilant and find out as much information as I can. Which is why I'm still here today, and the fact your mother told me to keep an eye on her boys," smiled George as he took off his hat. "Will you be all right once Father finds out we have gone?" asked Charlie. "Why, of course I will, Master Charlie. My lower back is giving me trouble again. I had to have the day off." Charlie laughed out loud. "Now I know that will work. Father always said that since you were injured when that iron girder hit your back, it is a wonder you can still stand straight." With that, they said their goodbyes again, and Charlie turned to give the house one last look before starting his new adventure. At Oakfield Manor, Lady Margaret was preparing to go riding with Lady Sarah and have a picnic on the hill overlooking the Oakfield estate. "Ready, Sarah?" "Yes, Lady Margaret. I am looking forward to the ride and picnic. Will there be fruit cake?" laughed Lady Sarah. Indeed, there is fruit-cake, replied Lady Margaret. Henry, are you ready as well? Yes, my lady. I will follow in the carriage just in case you tire from riding. Upon hearing that, it made Lady Margaret laugh and say, You have been talking to Master John. He's always fussing over my health. They set off for the hill, which is about 5 miles away from the house. Once they got to the hill, Henry laid out the picnic, and Lady Margaret and Lady Sarah sat to enjoy the view and the cake. After 2 hours, they decided to return to Oakfield. On the way back, they decided to ride across the open fields, which they had done many times before. Henry was taking the dirt road back to the house, always watching the riders in the distance. As Henry emerged from the woods to the open road, he saw Lady Margaret's horse standing in the field next to something on the ground. Lady Sarah was riding towards him, calling for help. Henry opened the gate and rode across the field to the horse. It was then he saw Lady Margaret lying on the floor. Henry jumped off the carriage, only to find Lady Margaret had a deep wound at the back of her head. Henry, with the help of Lady Sarah, placed Lady Margaret in the carriage. "Ride to Dr. Simon's in the village and tell him I will be there very shortly," shouted Henry. "And tell him what happened." Lady Sarah rode off at speed. Henry arrived at the doctor's house within 10 minutes, and both the doctor and Henry carried Lady Margaret into the house. After examining Lady Margaret's wound, Dr. Simons noticed Lady Margaret's breathing was getting less and less. He turned to Henry and said, "Please fetch Mrs. Turner and her sister from next door." "Is there anything I can do to help?" asked Lady Sarah. "Please sit and comfort Lady Margaret for a while." Henry returned with both women and was shocked to see Lady Sarah in tears, and Lady Margaret's face was covered with a sheet. The doctor was standing there with his head bowed. He turned to all three of them and said in a sad tone, "Lady Margaret has left this world."
I just wanna love you, just wanna hold you, just wanna be with you till we grow old. Please tell me you'll stay. You said my words.
This is an audio-visual story of a heart-wrenching tale set in the 18th century. Get ready to embark on the continuing journey of love, sacrifice and heartache of the unbreakable bond of true love between Edward and Isabella. Episode 4, Dark Secrets See the Light. It has been a few days since Lady Margaret passed away. Isabella may seem strong on the outside, but she is heartbroken on the inside. Lady Margaret was everything to Isabella. She was not only Isabella's guardian, but more like a mother as well as a friend. Lady Margaret will be laid to rest in the family vault on the estate. It will be a private funeral, with only a few close friends. Isabella told everyone working at Oakfield Estate that they are welcome to attend the service. The funeral will be early in the morning. As that was always Lady Margaret's favourite time of day, Isabella has made it clear to the Archdeacon of Surrey that it was to be a celebration of Lady Margaret's life and not a solemn service. Isabella wanted Lady Margaret's last day, before being placed to the family vault, to be a happy one, as Lady Margaret would have wanted. Later that day, Master John met with his friend Jack, who works on Lord Peterson's estate. "Jack, I got your message to come and see you. What is it you wanted me for?" "His lordship asked me and young Master Parsons to fetch the horse from the meadow where Lady Margaret fell. It was after we came back here to the stables that I noticed something was not right with the saddle." Jack proceeded to show John the underbelly strap from the saddle. John inspected the saddle very carefully. There was indeed something wrong with the strap. "You have noticed it, John?" "Yes, my friend, I have, and you're right. Someone has put crushed poison oak leaves and mixed them with the grease on the strap, which means when the horse sweats from a gallop, the poison will take effect and cause the horse pain," said John. "I don't understand how Henry did not notice it when preparing Lady Margaret's horse," asked Jack. "It's not something you would notice, as the grease is black, and when mixed with crushed poison oak leaf, it's almost impossible to notice," replied John. At that moment, Lord Peterson arrived with Lord Kemp and came into the barn to ask about Lady Margaret's horse. Lord Kemp noticed John with the saddle and asked if there was anything wrong with it. "Poison oak leaves mixed with the grease, sir," replied John. "The same trick we used in South Africa on the enemy's cavalry officers," said Lord Kemp. "Yes, sir, the very same." "Let us walk in the garden, John," said Lord Kemp. "Master Jack, not a word about this to anyone, understood," said Lord Peterson. "You have my word, my lordship." The three men proceeded to walk into the garden. They stopped at the lake and sat in the shade of a bandstand. "John, I know since you were assigned to protect Lady Margaret and Isabella after the Major died, you have become very aware of the problems Lady Margaret faced regarding the land in Norfolk, as well as the situation of Isabella." "Yes, I have, but with the help of William, the captain, we've been able to control any situation away from Lady Margaret." "How long is it now you have been at Oakfield?" "Almost 18 years, sir. At first it was to keep a promise to Lady Margaret's brother, and it was not long before it started to feel like home as well," replied John. Captain William and Master John's story. They served together in the British Army and later for the Intelligence Division, working for the Palace and the British government's Foreign Office. The captain was a captain in the army, while Master John was a sergeant. Both men have served together along with Lady Margaret's brother, Lord Henry Oakfield, who was a major in the cavalry under the command of Lord Kemp. All three men fought in the same campaigns and had a strong bond of trust and friendship. But tragedy struck in early 1864. Major Oakfield was leading his men to the British Army camp near Lake Bosumtwe when his horse was shot from underneath him, throwing the major to ground with force snapping his neck, killing him instantly. When William and John were packing the major's things, ready to be transported back to Britain, William found 3 letters, one for John, one for Lady Margaret, and one for himself. William gave John his letter. John proceeded to open it and began to read, then said, "I am to travel back to England, with the Major's belongings to Oakfield Manor in Surrey, and hand the other letter to Lady Margaret. I am not to ask questions, only to follow along with what Lady Margaret requires after she has read the letter, and I have orders to return to London and report to the Foreign Office," replied William. 18 years later they are still working together, respecting Lord Oakfield's last wishes, as well as serving Her Majesty, Queen Victoria, and the government. After the service, Lady Margaret was laid to rest. The house was not as you expect it to be after a funeral. Instead of low whispers and bouts of silence, it was alive with people talking and laughing, just as Lady Margaret would have wanted. Isabella was making sure everyone was enjoying themselves, and there was plenty to eat and drink. There was music being played by Lady Margaret's favourite quartet, and some people were playing bridge in the summer room. Others were in the garden enjoying the midday sun. In Isabella's words, "Today is Lady Margaret's day, a day to remember and celebrate each year." It has been almost 6 weeks since Edward left England for Italy, and he is now only a few days from arriving in England before travelling on to Colombia. Edward has had no news about Lady Margaret, only news from his brother Charlie to let Edward know he arrived in Hong Kong safe and well, and that his family are enjoying their new life. Unknown to Edward, there have been a lot of deals made by his father that will make Sir Arthur a very rich and powerful man, but at the expense of destroying others. Master John travelled to London to meet with the captain, and at the same time to pass on the information about Lady Margaret's riding accident, and also to check out the regiment record books for anyone left alive from the campaign in South Africa. John arrived at Victoria railway station early morning. The captain was waiting for him outside with another gentleman. "Good morning, John. I would like to introduce Carl Hockenrick, otherwise known as the Baron when not in the palace." The two men shook hands. "Pleased to meet you, Carl." "The pleasure is all mine, Master John. I have heard a lot about you over the years," replied Carl. "I have trusted the captain over many things over the years, and I know if the captain says you are a man of honour, then I have 2 friends I can completely trust." "Thank you for the trust, Carl," replied John. The 3 men set off to the captain's hotel, where they will have breakfast and talk over what they know about Sir Arthur, and why he is involved with the Bank of England Board of Directors, and always has certain members of Parliament on his side when it comes to changes in the law regarding land and property tax before and after death. Sir Arthur had just finished a meeting with a few members of Parliament and the Bank of England. He was more than satisfied that everything was in order to carry out his plan to get the land in Norfolk, as well as a few properties along the way. Not everything will be easy to carry out the plan to make money, but with the law on his side, Sir Arthur was confident he would succeed with it all, making money now and more in the future for everyone who is involved in making it all happen. The captain and Carl were listening to John talking about the saddle from Lady Margaret's horse and how it had been tampered with, and it was the same trick he had used on the enemy on the Gold Coast. John then went on to explain that only 5 people knew about the poison on the saddle straps: Lord Kemp, the captain, Major Oakfield, Corporal Davies and himself. Corporal Davies deserted the army not long after the Major died, and has not been seen or heard of since then. To this day, John still cannot understand why Davies just vanished. Davies was a great soldier, and even better at finding out information, as he could speak fluent German, Dutch, Spanish, French and Italian, and he could blend in anywhere, which is why he was always trusted by John and the captain to get the job done, no matter what was asked of him. There was a knock at the door. The captain got up to open the door and was heard asking the person to come in. "John, this is George." John was about to get up from his chair to shake George's hand, when the captain added, "George is Sir Arthur's doorman and Carl's inside man." "This is something new. I never knew we had anyone keeping an eye on Lowings," said John in a surprised voice. "We haven't," said the captain. "George has been working with Carl for many years and is now going to help us." The 4 men sat down and began to talk about Sir Arthur, the land in Norfolk, and Lady Margaret. No matter what happens in life, the heart will hold the bond of unbreakable love.
You set my world on fire.
Isabella was walking in the garden when she saw Mary rushing towards her, holding something in her hand. "Miss Isabella, a rider from Norfolk came with this letter and said it was to be given to you straight away. Thank you, Mary." Isabella opened the letter and began to read. Then suddenly she felt sick, angry and shocked all at the same time. "Mary, would you please send someone to ready my horse? I need to speak with Lord Peterson." "Very well, Miss Isabella. I will ask Henry to ride with you." Back in London, John was talking about what he knew as to what happened to Isabella on the night of the dinner party at Oakfield, and Sir Arthur's part in it all. He then went on to say he would need to find out more as well regarding the saddle. It was at that point George spoke. "I think you should start asking in the back streets of the docks near the Merchant's Tavern, where Master Charlie was sent by Sir Arthur to pass on a letter." "Did you see who it was for, or know who it was for?" asked John. "No, the letter was sealed but had no writing on the outside," replied George. The captain stood up and said, "Now I have something you all need to hear. This will help us stop this madness with one man having so much power." Lord Kemp and Peterson were backing Lowings on the land in Norfolk, and to make sure Lowings had the right backing, he promised he would get Edward to marry Lord Kemp's daughter. Edward walked out on the dinner, and his father that night. Until then, Lord Kemp was supporting Lowings, and then after Lord Peterson found out that Lowings had treated Isabella as a servant, not knowing who she was, and so tried to take advantage of her at Lady Margaret's dinner party, Lord Peterson told Lord Kemp, and both of them backed out of any deals relating to Sir Arthur for obvious reasons, which do not need to be discussed about today. John looked surprised. "How did you know all that, William, about Edward?" asked John. "I met Edward before he left for Italy, and he told me what had happened. But before then it was on the way back from the Americas when I was the captain of the ship, returning to England. That is where I met Edward. I didn't recognize him at first, but when I checked the ship manifest of passengers, I saw the name Lowings. It was then I knew." "Knew what?" asked George. "His father is Sir Arthur, who I have known for a very long time, especially after his wife died." George sat back down and went quiet for a moment. Looking up at the captain, he then said, "I remember you now, but your name was not William back then." The captain laughed when he knew George had remembered. "Well, my friend, that is a story for another time, but I can tell you it was with the help of Carl that I was able to gain Sir Arthur's trust and find him some good deals, with which he made a lot of money from, with the help of a few people in high places. I had to make him believe I was there to help him, and in return he would help me when the time comes." George sat back in the chair, slowly lit his pipe and then said, "So you are the man Sir Arthur calls the fixer. I have one question. Why pretend to be his friend and help him make money and get properties for almost nothing, and why the parlour games, pretending to be his friend?" Carl moved forward in his chair and said, I was asked to help find out how did Lowings not only have access to all of his wife's money and that of her father's, but he also somehow and directly after she died was able to obtain all of his wife's assets here in England and Germany. That, my dear George, made a few heads turn at the palace, as it is not normal for someone of Lowings' low breeding to have access to royal lands and titles in Germany, and this is why the captain was sent to me to help uncover all Lowings' dirty secrets. But as Sir Arthur, a member of Parliament, he is a clever man and covers his tracks well. It was then that not only George but John as well realised there was more to this Sir Arthur than meets the eye. Isabella and Henry arrived at Lord Peterson's home. As luck would have it, Lord Peterson was with Lord Kemp, who was about to leave for London. "Miss Isabella, what brings you here in such haste?" asked Lord Peterson. "I have some shocking news about the land in Norfolk," replied Isabella. "Please come into the house and let us talk. Lord Kemp, will you join us?" "Yes, I would like to know what has upset Miss Isabella so." Once they entered the study, Isabella handed Lord Peterson the letter. It was obvious there was something in the letter that made Lord Peterson shake with anger. He passed the letter to Lord Kemp, who began to read the following words. "Isabella, the land that belonged to Lady Margaret has been taken over by order of the High Court, the Government and the Bank of England. A notice has been put up around the village that states, the land is now owned by the bank as a forfeit for money outstanding, on land tax, and as stated by law, there are no known living relatives or a last will and testament left by the deceased, that being Lady Margaret. Any land with no rightful owner goes to probate and then sold to the bank to pay for taxes outstanding. Isabella, they have evicted the remaining families and have already torn down all houses, farmhouses and barns across the land. There are hundreds of workers living in tents on the land and have started to dig for sand on one part of the land and shingle on the other part of the land. Your friend, Anna." Lord Kemp didn't say anything, he just stood up, then walked to the window and said, "That man is not a man, he's the devil himself walking among us. We have to stop him, Peterson, by any means." "How can we do that now, my friend?" asked Lord Peterson. "I have a few good people who will find something to stop this madness." "Miss Isabella, please calm yourself. Good will always triumph over evil, and this is one evil that needs to be stopped." "Who are you talking about, Lord Kemp?" asked Isabella. "Lowings, that blasted little son of a whore. I'm sorry, Miss Isabella, for my outburst. That man makes my blood boil." Isabella asked, "Do you mean Sir Arthur Lowings, who has 2 sons, Charlie and Edward?" "Yes, the very same," replied Lord Kemp. Isabella sat down trembling. Lord Peterson told the maid to fetch the housekeeper and bring some water for Isabella. "My dear, what has made you feel so?" asked Lord Peterson. "I have just remembered who it was in Lady Margaret's study, looking through the desk and ledgers, and who tried to stop me from fetching Master John. It was Sir Arthur who tried to kiss me and then hit me across my face. I remember being thrown to the floor and feeling a sharp pain on my head." Lord Kemp slammed his hand down hard on the desk. "That low-life scum," he said with anger. Lord Kemp apologised again for showing his dislike for Sir Arthur to Isabella. He then went on to say, "For now there is nothing to be done, as the law is on the side of evil, for now, but by my word I will find a way to stop all this once and for all. Miss Isabella, let my housekeeper prepare a room for you for tonight so you can rest after such a shock," said Lord Peterson. "Thank you, but no, I need to go back to Oakfield and prepare for Edward's arrival." Both men looked at each other and in almost perfect harmony said, "Edward? Is this Edward someone special to you, Miss Isabella?" Isabella gave a little laugh and said, "Yes, you could say that, Lord Kemp. Edward is my husband and I know what you are thinking," said Isabella. "And the answer is yes, it is Edward Lowings." It was both of the men's turn to sit down in shock. "When? How? Where did this happen? Miss Isabella?" "Sorry, Mrs. Lowings," smiled Lord Kemp. "It was on the return journey from the Americas that Lady Margaret and I met Edward, and it was on that very ship Edward asked Lady Margaret for my hand in marriage. Now everything makes sense, why Edward did what he did and walk out the room," said Lord Kemp. "I give Edward my blessing and support for being an honourable man and for marrying such a strong and elegant woman." "Why did you say Edward walked out of a room, Lord Kemp?" asked Isabella. "Oh, it was nothing, my dear. Just a complete misunderstanding by me and with a lot of help from the devil." Lord Peterson sat back in his chair and said, Why are we only now hearing about it? Why not when you first arrived at Oakfield? Lady Margaret and Edward said it would be better to not say anything until he has sorted out all his legal paperwork and other things before we announce to the world. Lord Peterson and Lord Kemp agreed not to mention it to anyone until Edward and Isabella were ready. The captain and John travelled to the docks to start their search for any information as to why Charlie took the letter to the merchant's tavern. The captain was inside the tavern, talking to the landlord while John was playing cards in an illegal gambling den, with a few dock workers in a disused warehouse. After about 3 hours, they met each other down by the docks. "How did you get on finding any information about that letter?" asked John to the captain. After a few drinks, the landlord got talking a lot. "We need to find a man called Josh Thompson, aka the Rat. The landlord said he will be here working offloading bales of wool." Both John and the captain began to check the ships being unloaded when they heard someone call out, "Josh, look at this beauty." They waited until he was alone, and that was when the captain walked up to Josh and asked if he knew where he could get a few barrels of rum for a good cheap price. "It is illegal to sell or buy rum without paying the import duty, sir. I need to find a way to get the rum. It is for the regimental ball. I have money to pay," replied the captain. "You will need to talk to the professor. You will find him in the Chinese district, at a place called the 3 Moons. He is normally there at this time of day." The captain turned after thanking the man for his time and proceeded to meet with John. "Did you hear, John?" "Yes, and I know where to look for this professor. It is only a street away from here." Both of them walked into a building that looked as if it had seen better days. They were met by a very large man with tattoos filling his whole body. He stopped them from going any further into the building and pointed to a man behind a desk. "What brings 2 fine-looking gentlemen to my establishment today?" asked a very old-looking man with no teeth. "We were sent here to speak with the professor. We were hoping to buy barrels of rum for tonight's regimental ball," replied the captain. "Wait here," said the old man. He then went into a back room. Then after a few minutes or so, he came out and said, "This way, if you please." As the captain and John walked into the room, they could see a man sitting on a large bed smoking a small pipe. Behind him were 2 large men, obviously some sort of street fighters, now a sort of bodyguard. They were asked to sit down and state their business of why they are here. The captain began to explain when the professor stopped him and said, "I want to hear it from him," pointing to John. John began to explain what they wanted and why, when the professor said, "You're still full of bullshit. I see nothing has changed. Has it, John?" It was then when the professor, who was sitting in the dark, moved forward. Both the captain and John looked at each other in disbelief. Sitting in front of them was Corporal Davies. "Surprised to see me again, John, and alive, no thanks to you. How have you been, Captain? It is good to see you, unlike your companion." "I have so many questions, but time is short. But I have to ask, how did you end up here?" asked the captain. "Let us just say, after he left me to die in the mountains after we destroyed the enemy's supplies, I was found by some local hunters who took me in and healed my wounds. I then made my way back to England and found I had a talent for selling some of the shipments coming into the docks that no one would miss," said the professor. "I will not explain my actions, but it was all your own doing. You went on the other path down the mountain to the village to see the woman you had been sleeping with, and when I heard the shots fired, I did as we were trained to do, to push on to the next mission," replied John. "That's as maybe, but I thought we were a team and always had each other's backs," snapped the professor. "Over the years I have regretted not going back for you, but you know we had a job to do regardless of casualties. I can only apologize for not thinking as a friend, only the mission." The professor stood up and walked towards John, who also stood up. Both men looked each other in the eye for a few minutes, when the professor said, "To hell with it. If it was not for your stubbornness for following orders, I would not be living the life I have now." With that, the professor put his hand out in friendship. John shook the professor's hand, and then suddenly they embraced as brothers. "Now we are old friends again. What can I do for you both?" John began to ask what the professor knew about Sir Arthur. The professor turned and sent the 2 men behind him away. "You are playing with the devil's fire asking about that man. He has more power than anyone could have in 1,000 lifetimes." "I need to ask, who else could have known about mixing poison with grease on the strap of a saddle, because as far as I know, "There was only the 5 of us who knew," said John. The professor smiled and said, "John, you're getting old and forgetful. Who else was with us when we planned the raid? Major Oakfield and his orderly, Private Thompson. Remember, he jumped ship in Gibraltar just as we set sail to India. He was Irish and always talked about a revolution against the noble families." John said out loud, "How could I have forgotten about that tow rag? Where is he, do you know?" The professor smiled. "Yes, I do, and he is not far from this very room. Take me to him. I need answers." The 3 men walked into another room where there were men and women lying around smoking opium. The professor pointed to a man in the corner. It was obvious he was in the effect of the opium. John sat on the rags for a bed next to him and began to talk. The professor stepped forward to look and said, "I've seen that look before. He is dying from taking too much opium." John was frantic to find out what Thompson knew and began to shake the man. "What do you know about Lady Margaret and Sir Arthur?" Thompson just lay there, his eyes looking into nothing. "Tell me. If you have any decency left, do the right thing and tell me." Thompson partly responded and feebly pointed to his coat. The captain searched the pockets and found a letter. He began to read it. "Now we know who it was who caused Lady Margaret's death. It was Thompson." But before John could react, the captain went on to say, "We have the evidence, but there is something else in the letter. If you do this one last thing for me and get rid of Lady Margaret in your special ways, I will pay you double the money you got for your trouble last time when throwing that rich noblewoman off London Bridge. I will say it was very clever of you to use chloroform first." John and the captain could not believe what they just found out. Sir Arthur not only arranged for Lady Margaret's death, but the death of his own wife. "We have that son of a bitch," said John. The captain said, "And what do we have him with? This is just a letter. Anyone could have written what's inside it." He was clever in his choice of words, naming Lady Margaret but not his wife, making it look like Thompson was only interested in killing the nobility for money. It's our word against his, and Thompson's word would be hard to believe even on a good day. "That would be a very hard thing to do on any day," said the professor. "He is dead. How many more will die at the hands of this evil excuse for a man?" Both the captain and John looked at each other and said in a concerned voice, "Isabella."
I just wanna love you, just wanna hold you, just wanna be with you till we grow old. Please tell me you'll stay or take. I just wanna love you, just wanna.
This is an audio-visual story of a heart-wrenching tale that spans continents and time, set in the 18th century. Get ready to embark on a journey of love, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bond of true love. Episode 5. The Devil Sets His Trap. Edward arrived at London docks and proceeded to oversee the unloading of some trade goods he had brought from Italy. After signing a few papers for the ship manifest, Edward had his luggage put on a wagon to go to the train station, ready for his journey to Oakfield Manor to see his beloved Isabella, when he was approached by a man. "Good morning, Edward. I have been sent to greet you on behalf of Captain William. My name is Davis, better known around here as the Professor. The captain has urgent business to attend to. He asked me to take you to his hotel to meet with an old friend of yours and Charlie's." "Has this anything to do with Arthur Lowings, my father?" asked Edward. The professor then handed Edward a letter from the captain, which he began to read, then said, in an angry voice, "He may be my father, but I am not his son. Let's go, Professor. I need to find out what the hell is going on." Isabella was returning to Oakfield with Henry and Lord Kemp when she met the captain and John on the way. "Captain, John, what brings you here at this time of day?" John replied, "You, Miss Isabella, we wanted to escort you back to Oakfield and make sure everything is well with you." Before Isabella could reply, "Gentlemen, there has been a situation in Norfolk. Let us discuss this messy business back at Oakfield, that is, if Miss Isabella agrees," said Lord Kemp in an agitated voice. "Please, Lord Kemp, you have no need to ask, especially regarding what is happening in Norfolk." "Thank you," he replied. Edward arrived at the hotel with the professor. As they entered the room, they were greeted by George, Sir Arthur's doorman. "Master Edward, I am so pleased to see you again. I just wish it was under different circumstances." "George, it is good to see you again. But what is this all about? What has been going on?" replied Edward. The 3 men sat down and began to talk. "Is Isabella and Lady Margaret all right?" asked Edward. "Isabella is fine," replied the professor. "Thank the stars Isabella is all right." Edward thought for a moment and said, "Wait, you only said Isabella is fine. What of Lady Margaret?" The professor began to explain about the riding accident, but not why it happened or who was behind it, for obvious reasons. The time was not now to let Edward know that his father was behind not only the death of Lady Margaret, but also the death of Sir Arthur's wife, Edward's mother, all those years ago. Edward listened very carefully to every word being said by the professor. He then turned to George and asked, "How are you involved with all of this, George?" George began to explain to Edward about what his mother had done all those years ago and how she did not trust Sir Arthur, which is why she had the air vent placed in the study and office in the house, and why he has been helping Carl and the captain for years with information of Sir Arthur's business. Edward thought for a moment, then said, "It sounds all cloak and dagger and could be a story from that new Sherlock Holmes novel by Arthur Conan Doyle. It may sound like a novel, Edward, but everything we have told you is real and has and is happening, which is why Lady Margaret's brother's land needs to be saved from your father and those supporting him," said the professor. "Tell me what happened to the land, and why so soon after Lady Margaret's death?" asked Edward. The professor began to explain what the government and the Bank of England had done when there was a knock at the door. George opened the door and was heard saying, "Please come in, we have been expecting you." Isabella, Lord Kemp, Master John and the captain arrived at Oakfield and proceeded to go into the study. "What can we do about the land in Norfolk?" asked Isabella. "Nothing for now," replied Lord Kemp, who then asked Isabella to show the captain and John the letter. After reading the letter, both John and the captain looked at each other when the captain asked, "May Lord Kemp and myself be excused for a moment, Miss Isabella?" "Yes, of course." The two men then went into the garden. "What information have you, William?" asked Lord Kemp. "It is better if you read this letter I have first," replied the captain. Lord Kemp began to read. As he was reading, it was obvious he was ready to explode with anger. He looked up from the letter and said to the captain, "I swear, I will bring down that animal Lowings and all who are with him. William, I think it is time we start to break down Lowings' little empire. We will start from within his own kingdom, and what better way to start with those who stand to lose the most, the bank." Meanwhile, back at the hotel, the guest was invited into the room by George. Edward turned and was shocked to see his friend Otto, the German diplomat from Colombia, standing there. Edward got up from his chair to greet his old friend and asked, "Otto, what brings you here at a time like this?" "I was sent here by our friend in the Colombian government after your father tried to stop the coffee trade to Britain, and he even tried to stop the trade to America, but he failed. The president knew something was wrong and sent me here to find out what it is." "So what did you find out, Otto?" asked the professor. "Edward, your father has managed to block any money from Colombia to you, including the gold mine. He used political power, lobbying MPs in the British government that trade with Colombia goes against the treaty Britain has with Spain, who has colonies in the Americas. As of 2 days ago, you are now a wanted man, under the law of causing political unrest." Edward just sat back in his chair and thought for a moment, then said, "George, you need to go back to the house and carry on as normal. Talking of normal, what did Arthur say when he found out Charlie had left with his wife and children?" "Only did I notice when Master Charlie left, to which I replied, 'No, sir, I was home with my bad back for 2 days.' That seemed to do the trick. He never asked again," replied George. Otto stepped forward and said, "Edward, you need to go somewhere safe and lay low until this mess can be sorted out." "I am not leaving without my wife Isabella," snapped Edward. Otto said that he would make sure Isabella was safe under German diplomatic protection. This seemed to have made Edward feel better. The professor looked at Otto and asked if he would travel to Oakfield now to make sure Isabella was safe. "Edward, we need a ship and fast. I will have one ready for tonight and be at the docks near the 3 Moons at 10 p.m. The 4 men were about to leave when Edward asked Otto to give the captain a small leather case that had important documents. "Tell the captain he can use the documents to his advantage. He will know what to do." Sir Arthur was travelling back to London from Norfolk, feeling very pleased with himself. Everything was going his way, and now he had control of the land in Norfolk. His next step was even bolder, and with the bank behind him, he felt good. He not only has the land in Norfolk, but has stopped the flow of Edward's money from Columbia, thinking Edward will come crawling back to the family home. With Sir Arthur's next move, he felt certain he would soon become Lord Lowings or Lord Arthur. He liked the sound of either of them. As Sir Arthur left the train, he was met by Pete Turnbull, the landowner from Norfolk, who is a man who would do anything for money. "Is it done?" asked Sir Arthur. "Yes, it was easy. He was so far gone taking opium that I only needed to supply him an extra pure batch of it." "What about the body?" asked Sir Arthur. "It was taken to the hospital for dissection to trained surgeons and doctors." "Good. Now that little problem is out of the way, the rest will be easy. Did you collect the papers from the bank?" asked Sir Arthur. "Yes." "Good. Now we need to go our separate ways and meet at the club before going to Surrey tomorrow." Isabella woke up early, made herself presentable, and went to the breakfast room. She was surprised to see Lord Kemp, Master John, the captain, already sitting waiting for her. Isabella noticed someone new at the table and was about to ask when the captain said, "Miss Isabella, this is Otto, a friend of Edward's and also the German diplomat in Columbia." "Welcome to Oakfield, Otto. Edward has spoken of you many times, and of your father Karl. I believe your father was related to Edward's mother." "Thank you for your hospitality, Miss Isabella. Yes, my father and Edward's mother were cousins," replied Otto. Before Isabella could reply, Lord Kemp said, "Miss Isabella, Otto came with news from Edward, and it is not good news. Edward's father has found some way to have the government and the Bank of England deny Edward access to his money from Columbia and the coffee trade. From what we know, it's not safe for you to be here at Oakfield either." They sat in the breakfast room for most of the morning, talking about what Sir Arthur had been doing. It was about 1 o'clock in the afternoon when the sound of carriages and horses was heard arriving outside the main entrance of the house. John looked out of the window and saw a few men he recognized who were clearly from the bank and 2 members of Parliament, who John knew were all part of Sir Arthur's corrupt club. John turned to the others and said, "It has started. They are going to use the same move they used for the land in Norfolk." Lord Kemp was so furious, the captain and John had to restrain him from doing anything rash. Otto told Lord Kemp, John and the captain to stay in the room. "Allow me to find out what and why these men are here, Miss Isabella. Please, may I have a word with you?" Otto then began to talk to Isabella quietly. There was a knock on the door. The butler was about to make his way to see who it was, when Isabella told him to go to the kitchen for now. Otto opened the door, and there were 2 men standing there, smugly smiling at each other. One of them was holding some official-looking documents. "By order of the Bank of England, Parliament, and by the law of the land, this house, Oakfield Manor, and all lands as of 2 days ago belong to the bank. You are hereby given 1 day to leave said house and land. Failure to do so will result in anyone still in the house to be forcibly removed," said one very large man, who must have been the one in charge of the whole thing. He then proceeded to hand a document to Otto, who accepted the document and said to the men, "Gentlemen, before you settle down for the day, I must ask you to leave." The 2 men began to laugh. "I don't think you fully understand the situation, sir. You are on the Bank of England's property without permission, and we have been generous in allowing you 1 day to leave said property," replied the large man. "On the contrary, sir, I believe it is you who does not fully understand. I am here at the request of the palace and your government. I am the German ambassador newly appointed by Queen Victoria herself, and as such wherever I stay is known as German soil, and as such is not governed by your law. I am afraid you have come on a wasted journey, gentlemen, so if you don't mind, please leave unless you wish to have an international incident on your hands." Otto proceeded to show them the official diplomatic ring. The 2 men turned and waved to the others, a sign to leave. Both Otto and Isabella returned to the breakfast room, where the 3 men stood up and applauded Otto for his quick thinking in using his authority over the bank and Parliament. While Lord Kemp began to read the document the men from the bank had given Otto, the captain said that it was a smart move to use the ring. Isabella noticed the ring, which reminded her of something but could not remember what it was. Even in the darkest of times, love will be the light to guide you out of the darkness.
Till we grow old, please tell me you'll stay or take me away. I want you for myself every single day.
Edward was writing a few letters, while the professor was at the docks looking for a ship that was leaving England. "George, take this letter with you and pass it on to Carl." "Very good, Master Edward. I will pass it on as soon as possible." "Thank you, George, for everything. I had no idea all this was going on for all these years, especially as my mother knew what he was like." "Your mother was a great lady, sir, and there was a time she was in love with your father until he became a member of Parliament, and he could use the power of the government to get rich and powerful. That's how he was able to obtain your mother's assets in Germany soon after she died. There was something your mother said a long time ago when she stopped trusting your father. Your mother said to both myself and Carl that she had something that would bring Sir Arthur down, but we never knew or found out what it was, as she died 2 days later. One thing your mother was very strict about was for you and your brother never to find out about your father until you could look after yourself in the world. She didn't want anything to happen to you if you knew before you had the strength to stand up to him. I understand why Mother wanted to protect us, but now his true colors are showing. What an evil, selfish excuse for a man he is. He will find whatever he is up to is not going to be easy, not while I am alive." The professor was making his way back to the hotel when he noticed some men who were not dock workers, nor from the ships. After asking around, he found out they had been hired by the bank to work with the Metropolitan Police, to stop Edward's ship bound for Colombia from leaving, and to hold Edward in a cell until he is transported to a private debtor's prison. The professor arrived at the hotel, entered the room, and told Edward about what the bank had done hiring those men, and why. Edward sat back in his chair and said, "So my father wants to lock me away, so he can control my money. Otto was right all along. He told me in Colombia that not all things in England are not the same as before I left. He added Sir Arthur is looking for more than being a sir. It is only now I understand what his meaning was. I have to find a way to stop him from destroying anyone else's life. You can only do that once we leave England and have a plan," replied the professor. "We? I can't have you involved in this. You have your life here." "I was involved as soon as I found out who was working for your father and why," replied the professor sharply. After a few minutes, Edward passed the professor a letter and asked if he could take it to an address in Bond Street, wait for a reply, and bring back a small carry case. As the professor was leaving the room, he turned and told Edward to be ready to leave at 11 p.m. It had been 2 days since the bank sent men to Oakfield Manor. Lord Kemp had left early in the morning to attend to some business and use his military contacts to find any information as to what Sir Arthur was planning next. John, Otto and Isabella were in the study talking about the situation of the house and lands. "Is there nothing that can be done to save the house and land from that man and the bank?" asked Isabella. "Not while the bank has the right and the blessing from the government," replied John. "We will have to leave here as soon as possible, Miss Isabella. You need to travel to a safe place," said Otto. "I will go to my Edward, and we can find a place to live a life together. I don't care where as long as we can be together," replied Isabella. Just then the captain walked into the room, holding a telegram. "We need to get Miss Isabella away from here tonight. That low-life snake Sir Arthur is here, and we'll have an official document claiming the house and land belong to the government. The house is to be used as a residence for King Alfonso, 12th of Spain, while he is in England. He will arrive in a few weeks." Isabella turned her head away to not show her tears to the others. John said, "We have prepared for this, and we packed only what is needed. We are ready." "I want to go to my Edward," said Isabella, fighting back the tears. The captain took a letter out of his pocket and handed it to Isabella. "This letter was handed to me from a messenger from London, along with one for myself. It's from Edward." Isabella sat reading the letter for what seemed to be an hour before she said, "Captain, could you find a ship for us within a day? Edward has arranged for a ship for yourself and John. Edward and the professor had no choice but to leave last night, but you will both be reunited soon." "Who is the professor?" asked Isabella. John and the captain seemed to speak at the same time and said, "He's a good man. He will protect Edward." Isabella then asked why is it not safe for her to stay here and just leave when the men arrived again. The captain and John looked at each other. Both knew why it would not be safe, but thought it was best not to tell Isabella. Otto turned to John and said in a low voice, "You mean that devil of a man would put Miss Isabella in a house of exotic women for the pleasure of those fat politicians and bankers, as she has no guardian since Lady Margaret died, but she is married to Edward now, and that must count for something. No, my friend, to mention they are married now would be suicide. It will give Lowings the means to destroy the marriage by saying Isabella used voodoo to charm Edward into marrying her, and then he could have her flogged and placed in a prison or sent somewhere where no one will find her," replied John. Isabella was gathering a few things in her room for the trip when John entered the room with Otto to see if they could help. "John, could you collect Lady Margaret's box of jewellery from her room? Also, you will see a leather document case. I will need that as well." "As you wish. And would you like me to get Lady Margaret's journals, the ones she started when her brother died?" "Yes, please. I had forgotten about those. I think there are 7 altogether on the bookshelf near her desk." It was late when they left Oakfield Manor. Isabella refused to look back at the house that was her home. She said to herself, "It will be my home again one day." Once they arrived at the docks, there were a few of the professor's men waiting for them to make sure they got on the ship safe and sound. Otto was saying his goodbyes to John and Isabella when Isabella noticed the ring again. She clapped her hands and said, "I remember now. Lady Margaret gave me her brother's ring and some documents. I put them in the secret place inside the window ledge, the one you made for me, John, all those years ago. I checked there before we left, and I have both the ring and the documents, plus a few things from when you were a very young girl," replied John. Isabella was so happy to remember that she had something special belonging to Lady Margaret, her brother's ring. It is now late October, and it has been 3 months since Isabella and John left Oakfield Manor. Sir Arthur has been using Oakfield as his main residential home for the last 9 weeks. Everyone except Mary the cook has been dismissed from working in the house, and Sir Arthur has his people working there. Mary was allowed to stay because of the fact her cooking was well known in the district as the best. Sir Arthur made sure everyone knew he had the best food served when he had one of his many dinner parties. Sir Arthur was in the study talking to a few gentlemen from the Bank and Parliament about the King of Spain's visit in November. With the King of Spain here, we could use that to our advantage with trade, and the small matter of having all the trade of sugarcane, coffee and tobacco from Puerto Rico, said Sir Arthur in a smug way. Yes, and maybe with the King's help we could persuade the President of Colombia to give us, Parliament, the 30% of the gold mine of your son Edward, shouted a very loud, large man, spilling his brandy as he laughed. I have no son in Edward. I will not attach myself to an enemy of the crown or our great government, smiled Sir Arthur. Groans were echoing around the room. All right, our great government and then the crown. This made everyone in the room laugh out loud. At that moment, the butler arrived to tell Sir Arthur there was a gentleman to see him in the library. Excuse me, gentlemen, I have a matter to attend to. Please feel free to help yourself to more drinks. Sir Arthur then proceeded to walk to the library, where Pete Turnbull was waiting for him. Well, what did you find out? Asked Sir Arthur. I know where they are, and it's not out of the reach of us using the law over there as the island is in British hands, replied Turnbull. What blasted island are you talking about? Said Sir Arthur, frustrated and in an angry tone. Jamaica, sir. They are living in Jamaica at Morant Bay. Good, they are within our reach, and the only piece missing to complete my plan. Can you find trusted men to send and deal with it all? Asked Sir Arthur. They have already left England, sir, and will be there soon, and deal with the problem, replied Turnbull. On hearing that, Sir Arthur said, It's late. Go to the kitchen and tell Mary I sent you down to have something to eat and drink. When you are finished, you can sleep in the stable hand's room. With that, Sir Arthur turned and went back to the study to join his elite club of power. Edward and Isabella had set up a modest home near the sea in Jamaica, and John and the Professor had built their huts near Edward and Isabella. There was no talk of England or Sir Arthur. They were waiting for news from the captain and Carl. John and the Professor rebuilt or repaired the small fishing boats the locals use, for free in exchange for fish, fruit or vegetables. Isabella teaches the children from the small community, and Edward helps local farmers get the best prices for the crops they sell to the trading companies on the island. The local people call Isabella, Edward, John, and Professor Talawa, which is a Jamaican patois word that means to be strong, fearless, strong-willed, and not to be underestimated. It was one morning Edward was repairing a wall when he noticed a small box that had fallen between the gap between the old rotten inner wall and the new wall. He pulled the box out, and realized it belonged to Isabella. He called her into the room and said, "Look what I have found," looking pleased with himself like a schoolboy handing the teacher an apple. "My box. I thought I had lost it." Isabella sat down and opened it. There were a few things from her childhood and the documents Lady Margaret had given her, and then she saw the ring and quickly placed it on her finger. It looked too large for Isabella's small hands, but she didn't care. Isabella was proud to wear it. Isabella opened the document with her name on it and began to read. After a few minutes, Edward noticed Isabella's eyes, and he could see she was getting emotional. "What is wrong, my love? Why the tears?" asked Edward. For a moment, Isabella could not speak. Then, lifting her head, she said, "Lady Margaret changed my position in the house." "What do you mean, my love? Changed what?" Isabella handed Edward the document, stood up and just looked out of the window. Edward began to read, and after what seemed to be ages, he got up and went to the door and called John and the professor into the house. Edward told them to sit down. Isabella had some unexpected news. "I have a document signed by Lady Margaret and Henry James, the Attorney General." Edward began to read. The first part reads as follows: "Now Isabella is married. Lady Margaret will no longer be Isabella's guardian, but will change the status of Isabella legally by the law of England, with Henry James as a witness on this day, 11th of August 1884, to be my legal daughter, and as such will inherit Oakfield Manor and all lands belonging to said manor, and any property and land of my late brother Lord Henry Oakfield, upon my death." Both John and the professor punched the air together and said, "Yes, we have the devil by the horns." Edward said, "We must return to England and claim what is rightfully Isabella's." "Yes," said John, "but not you, Edward. You are still a wanted man. I will return with Miss Isabella and meet up with the captain and Carl to work out the best way to deal with this. John is right. We need to find a way to get your name cleared and also return what is rightfully yours, your money and trade rights." Isabella was sad, thinking she would be without her Edward again, and said, "I have loved being here and the life we have, just being happy and free. But I also want justice for what that man has done to not only Edward, but for all those people who were in his way to have more power and wealth." Everyone sat there for a while, partly in shock that they had been given such a powerful document that could change everything. The professor asked to look at the document, and Edward handed it over. He then proceeded to inspect it. Suddenly the professor said, "Did you see the few lines in Latin on the reverse side of the document?" Edward and Isabella shook their heads. Miss Isabella was there, an old-looking sealed letter with the documents. Isabella looked surprised he knew about the letter and said, "Yes, there is. How did you know?" "It is written here. The letter must only be opened after you have read this document." Isabella asked Edward to open the letter, who then broke the seal and began to read. After a few minutes, Edward asked Isabella to sit with him. "What is it, husband? Why do you look so pale all of a sudden?" John and the professor had noticed that Edward was visibly shaken by what he had just read. "It is a letter for you. It was written when you were 3 years old. The letter reads, 'My beautiful, funny and smart Isabella, I know you are too young to understand now, but when you are older, I hope you will understand why I had to go and leave you with your mother and Lady Margaret. I was called away to a place called South Africa. This will be the last time I will leave you, so next time I return to you both, we will live a happy life as a family with my wife and my beautiful daughter. I love you both very much. Never forget you both have given me a heart filled with love. Signed, Henry Oakfield, February 4th, 1866. Edward then said, "There is more to the letter after the message to Isabella, but it has more to do with the house and lands of Lord Oakfield." Just then the professor said, "The date in the letter was February 1866. The Major died a few months later." Isabella turned and said, "Lady Margaret told me a long time ago that my mother died of a broken heart after my father died. Now I understand the love they had for each other, because I feel the same way about my husband. My mother died a few weeks after hearing my father was dead. I remember as if it was yesterday. It was 4 days before my 4th birthday. We buried my mother. Then Lady Margaret took me to England to live in Oakfield Manor." Edward looked at the other documents and asked Isabella if had she looked at them to see who they were for. Isabella said, "Not really." Edward showed John the name on one of the documents. John looked up with a surprised look and with a shocked voice said, Why did Lady Margaret write to the Prince Regent, Prince Albert? Do you mean Queen Victoria's son? Asked Isabella. Yes, replied John. Edward was unaware that a ship bound for Jamaica was approaching and was set to dock in 2 days. On board are individuals dispatched by Pete Turnbull to carry out the unsavoury tasks assigned by Sir Arthur, a man who orchestrated the demise of his own wife and Lady Margaret. His sinister intentions extend to his son, with a callous pursuit of power and wealth.
I just wanna love you, just wanna hold you, just wanna be with you till we grow old. Please tell me you'll stay or take me away. You're my heart.
This is an audio-visual story of a heart-wrenching tale set in the 18th century. Get ready to embark on the continuing journey of love, sacrifice and heartache of the unbreakable bond of true love. Episode 6, When Greed Meets Truth and Love. In Hong Kong, Charlie has been enjoying his new life with his family working for his father-in-law. He has never felt so alive with life and enjoys his time with his wife and daughters. It is Sunday evening, and that is parlour game night for Charlie and the family. They were all playing a game called Pin the Tail on the Donkey. It was Charlie's turn, and one of his daughters placed the blindfold on over his eyes, then turned him round 3 times and said, "Go." Everyone was shouting, "Go straight, go left, turn around." Everyone was laughing and having fun, until Charlie tripped over and knocked over a large vase that belonged to his mother. It went down with a loud crash. Charlie felt bad when he took off the blindfold. He asked the girls to go into the other room so as not to cut their feet on the broken pottery. Charlie started to pick up the broken bits of pottery when he noticed a document hidden in the base of the vase. The base had a false base built onto the original one. He picked it up and began to read. It took a few minutes before Charlie realized what it was and how important and even dangerous it was to have such important information. Charlie called his wife into the room and showed her the document. It was so shocking that she had to sit down for fear of fainting. "You have to get the document to England and give it to your Uncle Carl in the palace. He will know what to do," Kate said worriedly. "I know, my love. I will leave tonight on the ship going to Southampton with its cargo of silk and tea," replied Charlie. "Then hurry, my love. Just pack a small trunk. I will arrange the carriage to take you to the dock." "Thank you, my love." Charlie left Hong Kong bound for a long trip to England. At Oakfield Manor, Sir Arthur was holding a meeting with the other 11 members of their elite gentlemen's club. "Gentlemen, we have much to discuss today, so it would be appreciated if we could agree more without objections. First, have we got all the paperwork for our proposals to the King of Spain when he arrives in 3 weeks?" asked Sir Arthur. "Yes, and we have the proposal for the use of the docks in Puerto Rico in exchange for private military firepower at Spain's disposal. Next, we have the trade agreement for sugar from Cuba, giving Spain 2 full cargoes of sugar for every 10 ships with sugar we bring to England. It is a winning situation for Spain, as it will cost them nothing to ship the sugar," said Pete Turnbull. "Make those 2 ships the smallest one we have," replied Sir Arthur. "Next is the difficult one. It's to allow us to mine for gold and silver in the Americas, giving Spain a quarter of gold and silver mined. I'm not too bothered with that one at the moment. I believe after making a deal with the Colombian government, we will have a ready-made gold mine, one my traitor to the Crown's son found, along with the coffee trade," said Sir Arthur with a smug look on his face. He then turned to his friends from the bank and asked, "Are they about to secure Edward's money for the government, meaning us as a form of forfeit? Now Edward is a wanted man." They all looked at each other and then at the ground, waiting for one of them to have the courage to tell Sir Arthur the truth. One man stood up and with his head lowered said, "It is not possible to obtain Edward's money." This made Sir Arthur slump back in his chair. He looked up and said for what reason. He was told that even though Edward had an account with the bank, he never actually used it, so that makes it impossible to take control of his account. "Where is Edward's money? It has got to be somewhere," shouted Sir Arthur. "We just don't know. We can only think he has put it in another country," said Pete Turnbull. "You had all better find out what Edward has done with all that gold and money if you want our club to stay untouchable." The meeting went on far into the night and early morning. Everyone was tired and went to their rooms about 2 a.m. Pete Turnbull went downstairs to the main kitchen to help himself to food and drink before sleeping in the stable hand's room. He was sitting by the fire, too drunk to get up, and not aware he was talking to himself. Mary walked in to find Turnbull drunk. She walked over to him, took the bottle away from him, called the butler to help her get Turnbull to his room. All the while Turnbull was talking to himself, unaware anyone was with him. They placed Turnbull on his bed and left him to sleep it off. Lord Kemp and the captain were in London. They were meeting 5 members from the House of Lords who were putting money into Sir Arthur's pocket to obtain the land in Norfolk and trade with Spain. These men were not from Sir Arthur's gentlemen's club. Lord Kemp has known them all since childhood, and so he knows they can be trusted. "Gentlemen, thank you for coming and for making the time out of your busy schedule to meet with me," announced Lord Kemp. "When we received your message about a meeting, we had to come especially as you mentioned. It would be in our interest and our reputation to meet," said Lord Hatfield. "Also, if our old friend calls a meeting, it must be important. As we all know, you would not hold a meeting unless it affects us and the country," said Lord Berkeley. "You may not know, but myself and Lord Peterson have removed our money and support from Lowings a few months ago, for reasons I am about to tell you. There is also a very urgent and important piece of information you need to know, which, if and when it comes to light, will affect you all while you are still associated with Lowings." Everyone gave each other a look as if they had heard a ghost story. Lord Kemp then asked them to listen to what the captain had to say. The captain's reputation is well known for being the best at finding out the facts and truth of any situation, which is why the Prime Minister and the Palace trust his judgment. The captain began to tell them about why Lord Kemp and Lord Peterson stopped backing Lowings and his get-rich plans, and how it all started with what happened to Miss Isabella and Lowings at the dinner party. Isabella is someone they all knew as Lady Margaret's companion. The captain then went on to talk about the death of Lady Margaret and the suspicious death of Lowings' wife, how Lowings obtained the land in Norfolk and Lady Margaret's home and lands by using the bank and government to do so. Everyone listened very carefully, especially after the captain told them about what Sir Arthur had done to his son and why Charlie left the family home to live in Hong Kong. The 5 men were divided into anger and revenge, but agreed they had been fooled by the charms of a snake. The captain calmed them down and then began to finish what he wanted to say. "Gentlemen, I have some good news for you. But first I need to know if you will stop supporting Lowings now you know the facts. They all agreed they would blacklist Lowings from their list and make life as a Member of Parliament difficult. But they have between them given a fortune to Sir Arthur, and it will affect them badly." It was then the captain pulled out one of the documents Edward gave him. "This is an official document signed and sealed by Henry James, the Attorney General. It states that I, William Waterman aka, the captain, have sole charge of all the monies now, and in the future of one, to use as the captain sees fit until such time I, Edward Lowings, can return to a normal life in England." The captain then went on to say that he would not only give the money back to the 5 men that Sir Arthur tricked into his plan, but he would double it on condition that they would wait for Lord Kemp's message and not do anything to make Lowings suspect anything is wrong. The captain told them to leave the money they gave Lowings as it was and not ask for it back. That way Lowings would think he still had them in the palm of his hand. They all agreed to go along with the plan Lord Kemp and the captain had to bring down Sir Arthur Lowings. Isabella and John departed on a ship bound for England, unaware there was another ship sailing into the harbour with men sent by Pete Turnbull on behalf of Sir Arthur, with the sole purpose of removing Edward from getting in the way of Sir Arthur's plan for wealth and power. In other words, with Sir Arthur's mind set only on greed as he has done for years, son or no son, Edward has to die. John went on deck only to see Isabella staring out to sea, as if in a daze. "Are you not feeling well, Miss Isabella?" asked John. Isabella turned, and it was obvious she had been crying. "Edward will be fine. He has the professor with him." "I know. I'm just feeling a little sad after I read the rest of the letter. Lady Margaret said in the letter that from the moment I was born, her brother was so happy and excited he had a daughter. He promised to bring me up well and always provide for my mother and myself. It broke not only my mother's heart, but Lady Margaret's heart as well when my father died. It was after my father's death and the death of my mother that Lady Margaret vowed to give me all the love I would have had from both of them. I am still in shock remembering that after all these years, the large portrait of Lord Oakfield hanging in the main hall, I used to spend hours looking at and thinking I wish he was here to be with Lady Margaret. Now I find out he was my father all along, and I wish he was here even more, so I could just hold him to say thank you for loving me and my mother. All I have is this ring to remember him by," said Isabella in a sad voice. John reassured Isabella that everything would be fine. Many people want truth and justice not just for her, but for everyone that Lowings has destroyed along his way to power and wealth. Edward and the professor were preparing a fishing boat after doing some repairs for one of the local fishermen when one of the farmers approached the professor, shook his hand, and then leaned forward and whispered something to the professor. "What was that all about?" asked Edward jokingly. "Good news. We have been invited to a carnival, which means free food and rum tomorrow night," said the professor in a jolly voice. "Why the whispers then?" asked Edward. This made the professor burst out laughing. "It's because you are a man of breeding, and he felt it was not his place to speak directly to you." "That is strange, because I talk with Billy all the time when getting the best price for his plantain and banana. He never has a problem talking to me then," snapped Edward. "That's farm business and different from social, in Billy's way of thinking," replied the professor. "He is set in his ways." Edward smiled and said he knows a lot of people like that in England. The two men carried on working on the boat before putting it back into the water, ready for the fishermen. Later that day, after they had eaten, the professor asked Edward to be ready to leave early in the morning for a trip to Port Morant so they could get fresh supplies from the early overnight trade ships. Edward, joking, said he would not bother to change and just sleep as he is. The professor said that was a good idea, he would do the same. Edward looked surprised at the reply, considering he was only joking with the professor, but could tell he was serious about not changing. It was 3:30 in the morning when both men left for the port. The professor told Edward to rest while the sea was calm. He would wake him when they were within sight of the port. Edward did not need to be told twice he was tired after worrying all night about Isabella. Power and greed may break many lives, but never the unbreakable bond of true love.
I just wanna love you, just wanna hold you, just wanna be with you till we grow old. Please tell me you'll stay.
The men sent to Jamaica to deal with Edward are now in Kingston, meeting with one high-ranking government member on the island and an old friend of Sir Arthur's. They had a sealed letter from Pete Turnbull to pass over to Sir Arthur's contact as soon as they arrived on the island. Now, with the location of Edward, they made their way to be near where Edward lives, so they could observe and pick the right moment to get the job done. The professor and Edward loaded the boat with fresh supplies and started to make their way back home. When Edward started to laugh to himself, the professor asked, "What has come into your mind to make you burst out laughing in such a way?" Edward began to talk about why it was a good idea they still to wear the same clothes from yesterday. The professor said they will be doing that a lot from now on, sleeping in their day clothes. Edward looked confused and asked why. The professor said, "Billy did not just tell me about the carnival, he also told me about some men who arrived on the island a few days ago. He was loading his cargo on the ship as the men went past him. Billy said that one of the men he recognized and said, 'That man was here 2 years ago when there was a fire at a Spanish farmer's house that killed everyone and just happened to be the largest farm on the island. It was reported as an accident, which is strange as the farm and land were soon owned by your father and one of the government men over here.'" Edward looked disgusted and angry at the same time. He has never really been a father to Charlie and myself for years. He has always been distant from being anything that resembles a father, only when it is in his interest. I now understand why my mother used to say, as long as she is alive, she will protect us from evil. So what you are saying is that these men are up to no good being here. This is why we have to be ready. I believe they are here for you, Edward, and not in a good way. We have the advantage. We know they are here, and they don't know you are not alone. Once we get back, we need to prepare. They will be watching the hut, so I will need to do something, which you must play along with." The professor began to tell Edward his plan. It is now 10 days before the King of Spain's visit with Queen Victoria, and also his visit to Oakfield Manor for a few days, while he is in England. Sir Arthur was very pleased with the way things were going his way. "Do I need to arrange an accident for your other son, Charlie?" asked Pete Turnbull. "No, he is the timid one. He cannot harm us or me. He is even scared of his own shadow," laughed Sir Arthur. "Now, have we got everything ready to make our fortune when the king arrives?" asked Sir Arthur. "Yes, sir. Everything is in place and ready, and everyone knows what to do on the day." "Good. What about the... That's strange, I know what I want to say, but cannot for the life of me remember what the word is," said Sir Arthur in an agitated voice. "Maybe you are overtired, sir. You have been working extra hard to get this far over the last few months." "I think you may be right, Turnbull. With all the business of the land in Norfolk, getting rid of that stubborn Lady Margaret, that opium-head Thompson, the arranged marriage between Edward and Lord Kemp's daughter, which Edward rejected. Yes, I am not surprised. I'm tired. Now tell me, have we got everything ready for the king's visit? Turnbull looked confused and said, Sir, I think you need to rest. We only just spoke about that a few minutes ago. Did we, I don't recall, but I do feel tired. I will lie down for a while. Isabella and John will arrive in England in 3 days, unaware that Edward's life is in danger. Charlie will arrive in 8 days. Both Isabella and Charlie hold information that can destroy Sir Arthur and his plans. Charlie has been doing a lot of thinking on the voyage to England, and now realizes just how evil his father is, and what he will do to achieve his ambition for power and wealth. He has had time to fully understand the importance of the letter and the significance of what was written in it. The fact that the document had individual seals by each signature made it very important and very dangerous, not only to himself, but to anyone with it in their possession. Each name on the list represents each member of Sir Arthur's Gentlemen's Club, including Sir Arthur. It also has information on what they have done in the past to gain their position in life and what lengths they did to achieve it. Charlie made a note of each one and found the crimes they had done ranged from blackmail, stealing from people's deposits of gold and diamonds, and forcing people out of their homes for their houses or farms, among other despicable tricks. It was his father's he was more interested in. It just said, I, Arthur Lowings, feel responsible for my house burning down and for the death of my wife in said fire. I know she did not suffer. I had given her something to make her fall into a heavy sleep. Charlie remembered his mother telling him not long after Edward's 2nd birthday, when Charlie was 11. His mother said his father was married when his mother and father first met, but married within a year from that first meeting after his father divorced his first wife, to be with her. Now Charlie has the evidence that his evil father probably killed his first wife to marry his mother. Charlie has a sickening feeling about what may have happened to his mother 23 years ago. It has been over 3 weeks since the men sent by Pete Turnbull arrived in Jamaica. Edward has played his part as a master to the professor, who was acting the part of a man suffering from the result of war, and that has made him behave like a child. Edward was sitting on a log watching the professor play in the surf on the beach. Now and then the professor would take a seashell to show Edward. To anyone watching, it was like watching a child playing on the beach. Each time the professor showed Edward a seashell, he was telling Edward who was watching them from the tree line, or when the men watching them changed places. It was early evening when Edward called the professor to have his supper. Edward stood in the doorway, watching a grown man pretend he was riding a horse to the hut. Edward could not help himself but give a little laugh as the professor rode the horse into the hut. Once inside, the professor told Edward that the men would strike tonight. He saw them all gathered in the tree line carrying weapons. "You know what to do, Edward?" said the professor. "Yes, and I am ready." "Good. Remember what you learned from the tribes in the jungles of the Americas, and what I have shown you. Stay in the shadows as much as you can." After they had something to eat, the professor told Edward to rest while he could. He will make a few childish noises now and then to keep the men thinking Edward and the professor are still awake. It was about 4 in the morning when the professor woke Edward and also stopped making childish sounds and blew the lantern out. It was only a matter of a few minutes when the door burst open and 3 of the men charged into the room, only to find no one there. One of the men ran out and shouted to the others near the hut to look around as no one was inside. He turned round to check inside again, and once inside, he along with the others started to take the hut apart, looking for Edward and the professor. One of the men saw a tall cabinet and pulled it over to look behind it. But as he did that, a large jar that was on top of it tipped over and covered all 3 of the men in oil and honey. They stood there cursing and laughing at the same time, and then suddenly one of the men dropped his lantern when it caught fire. But before any of them could do anything, they were engulfed in flames along with everything in the hut. They tried to run to the sea to put out the flames, but it was low tide and too far away. One by one they fell to the ground screaming in agony until there was silence. Edward and the professor got out of the hut by going under the floor and then headed to where the men were standing in the tree line. Quietly the professor whispered, "3 down, 4 to go. We can make our way to the shoreline further up the headland to use the fishing boat to make our way round to the village." The professor could see the other men running around searching for them by the fire from the hut. "Let's move now while they are still looking for us." They got to the beach and were making their way to the boat when there was a loud crack sound. Edward turned round and saw the professor on the ground. He ran back to help, The professor had been shot in the back. Edward helped him up and started to move as fast as they can to the boat. Edward could see the men were gaining on them. As they got to the boat, the professor shouted to Edward to get in and started to push the boat out. "Take the boat round the headland as we planned. Get to the village, you will be safe." "Get in," shouted Edward. But it was too late. The professor gave one last big push and the boat was already on the waves. Edward rowed the boat as hard as he could, so the boat would not get pulled back to shore. He looked up and saw the professor fire 2 pistols. One man fell to the ground, the other staggered back for a moment, then continued to run at the professor. Edward watched as 2 men ran at him laying on the ground. It was just then the boat went past the headland when Edward heard 2 or more shots. Thinking the worst, Edward rowed harder to get help. He heard another louder crack and then fell back into the boat, feeling a sharp burning pain in his shoulder. He had been shot by one of the men who made his way to the headland. He tried to row, but after a short while Edward passed out. Edward eventually woke up and looked up to see Billy and a woman tending the wound on his shoulder. "What happened? How did I get here?" Edward was still weak from losing so much blood and tried to get up, but fell back again. Edward said in a weak voice, "Billy, you have to find out what happened to the professor." Billy looked up and said they would find him. Billy went on to say, "You are not ready to move anywhere for now. You lost a lot of blood. You were very lucky. If the fishermen had not gone out to fish early this morning, we would never have found you, drifting in the sea." Isabella and John arrived in England and made their way to London. It was late afternoon when they arrived at the captain's hotel. They waited in the lobby until he arrived. "Miss Isabella, John, what brings you back to England? Is Edward and the professor with you?" said a surprised captain. "We need to talk. There has been a development that could be the start of Lowing's downfall. Edward and the professor thought it was better we returned alone," replied John. "Please let us talk about it in private." The captain went to have a word with the hotel manager and returned within a few minutes with 2 keys. "I have arranged for your luggage to be placed in your rooms." "Thank you, Captain," replied Isabella. Then all 3 proceeded to go to the captain's suite. Once inside, John handed the letter and documents over to the captain to read, while John and Isabella went to their rooms to change. It was an hour later when both Isabella and John returned to the captain's room. "Well, what do you think?" asked John. "Well, it's official. Miss Isabella is now the lady of Oakfield Manor, and as such is entitled to return to her home. Soon." "Soon? Why not now, Captain? Why wait? I want that devil of a man out of the house," said Isabella in a frustrated voice. "Lowings will soon find a way around it all, and with the bank and government behind him, you could lose everything. We need to play this smart, and we need the help of someone who could do that. It's late, and you both need to rest after your trip, Miss Isabella. You can take the main suite. John and I will be in the adjoining room for your protection." "But we have our rooms across the hall from you, Captain. I don't want to inconvenience you," replied Isabella. John explained to Isabella that it would be safer if she stayed here and told her if anyone in the hotel was working for Sir Arthur. They would find you easily, but not if you are here. Isabella agreed. John went to fetch their luggage from the rooms, while the captain showed Isabella what would now be her room. John returned with the luggage, and then he and the captain went into the adjoining room. In the morning they sat talking about how life was in Jamaica and how Isabella felt. Now she knew who her father was. It was 10 a.m. sharp when there was a knock at the door. "Let them in, John. That will be Carl and George." He opened the door. "Come in, gentlemen. I believe you have already met Miss Isabella." "I have not had the pleasure of meeting Miss Isabella, but I am very happy to finally meet you," said George. "Hello, George. I've heard so much about you, and all good, I hasten to add," laughed Isabella. The captain then stepped forward and gave the letter and documents to Carl. As he sat down to read, he noticed Isabella's ring. "May I have a closer look at the ring on your finger, Miss Isabella?" asked Carl. "The ring belonged to Lady Margaret's brother, and was given to me a few days after we returned from the Americas, along with a letter with those documents. Lady Margaret asked me to keep them in a safe place until the day came Lady Margaret left this world. I lost my memory of the ring and documents after I hit my head on a table when I confronted Edward's father in the study of Lady Margaret," Isabella replied. Carl inspected the ring and recognized it straight away, and the importance and meaning it carried, but did not mention it to Isabella. Carl looked up at Isabella and said that it was a beautiful family ring, and she must be very proud. "Yes, I am very proud to hold something Lady Margaret was very proud of and loved so dearly." It was almost an hour before Carl had finished reading everything in the documents and the letter. He looked up and said in a soft voice, "Miss Isabella, may I take this letter and this document with me? I would like to show someone the information." It was at that moment that the captain stepped forward and gave Carl 2 documents bearing the seal of the Colombian government. These belong to Edward. It is written in Spanish, mixed with some Latin. It shows that Edward is the only person allowed to mine for gold and trade coffee from Colombia for the next 30 years, said the captain. As soon as Carl saw the seals, he knew who to deal with and what to do to help Isabella and Edward with their situation. He got up and put the documents he was taking into a leather case, turned and said, "Captain and Miss Isabella, please stay here until I or John return." John looked surprised. "Why me and not the captain?" asked John. "I need you to meet someone, and I want you to tell them exactly what happened after Lady Margaret and Isabella returned from the Americas. You have first-hand knowledge of what happened at the dinner party and who is behind it all," replied Carl. The 2 men left the room and within 20 minutes arrived at a large grand house. Carl spoke to someone at the entrance to the house. Within a few minutes, the man returned and told the guard to open the gate. "The Prime Minister will meet you in the study." Carl and John followed the man into the study. After a few minutes, the Prime Minister entered the room. "Gentlemen, please be seated. Now, what brings the Queen's German advisor here today?" "I have some disturbing news that could rock the very foundation of not only your government but the whole country," replied Carl. The Prime Minister leaned forward, placed his arms on his desk and said, "I have a feeling this is not going to be a normal day. Please carry on and tell me what you have that is so important." Carl asked John to tell the Prime Minister the story of Lady Margaret, Isabella and Edward, Sir Arthur, and all the information John and the captain have found over the last few months. After John had spoken and told everything in fine detail, Carl handed the documents over. It was late afternoon when the Prime Minister had read everything, making notes as he did so. When he had finished, he looked up and said, "This is very bad and needs to be dealt with. But how and in what way can we stop this madness of this devil Arthur Lowings? I know I cannot just confront him with all this, not without solid evidence. He holds many politicians and lords in his pocket and could even find a way to remove me from office." John passed over a letter and a document from the captain. Carl looked at John surprised. He had no idea John had those documents. John went on to explain to both of them that the captain had prepared for such a day as this. "In your hand, you are holding the letter written by Arthur Lowings, saying he wanted this person to arrange the death of Lady Margaret, so he could then take control of Lady Margaret's estate on behalf of the government and the bank, and that he probably had his wife, Edward's mother, killed to gain her assets in Germany and control the family's money. The letter is from the captain with his outlines for a plan to bring Lowings to his knees and restore order in Parliament and the Bank of England. The Queen has trusted the captain for information for many years. Regarding the safety of the Empire, I feel we should take a look at his plans. Gentlemen, we're in for a long night. Let us continue after we have freshened up and have a meal, as it is getting late, and if you don't mind, I would like to have the captain join us." Carl looked up, said, "With due respect, sir, I don't believe it is wise to leave Miss Isabella alone, as she is the one in the most danger. Once Lowings finds out she is married to Edward and is the rightful owner of Oakfield Manor, I fear the worst will happen." "Very well then, we shall have them both join us. The captain can join us here in the study, and Miss Isabella can be entertained by my daughter Helen, who has just returned for a holiday away from her duties at Newnham College in Cambridge." Isabella and the captain arrived at the house at 7 in the evening. After the introductions were done, Isabella went with Helen to the parlour, while the men went into the study, for a long night of working on a plan to destroy everything Arthur Lowings had built, without embarrassing the government or the crown. It has been 3 days since Edward and the Professor were attacked that night, and since then, Edward has been recovering well. Was sitting on the porch when Billy arrived after going to the burnt-out hut that was once Edward and Isabella's home. "Well, did you find the Professor?" asked Edward. "Our friends in your village had gathered all the bodies together after they went to help with the fire. The Professor was not among them. We believe his body must have been washed out to sea," replied Billy. "How many are dead?" "4. The other 3 are either dead and washed out to sea with the Professor or still alive. But there was one not on the beach. He was on the headland around the bay. It was the one who shot me. So we can assume one of the men is still alive," replied Edward. "What will you do now, Master Edward? You can stay here for as long as you wish. You know that you are welcome to stay." "Thank you, Billy. I will need to heal properly and work out a plan." Edward got up to return to his bed. As he sat down, he heard a familiar voice from the window. That's typical. The gentry lay in bed all day while others work hard for a living. Edward turned and was shocked to see the professor standing at the window, covered in blood and in a bad way. He called out to Billy to rush to the window outside to help the professor. Billy and two men helped the professor into the room, laid him down, and Billy's wife fetched water and clean cloth for his wounds. Billy told the men to find the doctor in town and to tell him it's the professor who needs help. "How bad is it, Billy?" asked Edward. Billy checked the professor's wounds and said, "It was lucky the bullet went right through the lower side of the back. The knife wounds will heal quickly, but it is the wound in the stomach that can be a problem." The professor said as he looked up, "Well, I have had worse, but I am not as bad as the two who were on the beach trying to finish me off." Edward looked at the professor with a puzzled look. "I saw you on the ground, and the two of them were almost on top of you. I heard shots as the boat went round the headland. I guessed they had finished you off." The professor looked Edward in the eye and said, "Never underestimate a wounded man on the ground. I let them get close enough to me so I could finish them off at close quarters with my knife and last loaded pistol." "I should have known you would never give up a fight, wounded or not," said Edward. "There is still one left, the one who shot me from the headland." "Aye, I know, he is a slippery one, that's for sure. I would guess he has reported back to the government house in Kingston and trying to muster more men to finish us off. But if it is a messy business, the government man will not have anything to do with it, as it looks bad on him if the people in England find out that a man of stature such as you, Edward, has been hunted down and killed. It looks bad in the morning newspapers when one is having breakfast. It spoils the appetite," chuckled the professor. The doctor arrived and attended to the wounds, gave Billy some pills to help relieve the pain and an ointment for the wounds, and told Billy to change the dressing every 4 hours. The next morning, Edward and the professor were still resting when Billy came in and said that the man who was still alive was the same man who burned down the farm that killed the Spanish farmer and his family. "Where is he?" asked Edward. "He was in the next village asking if anyone had seen you or knew where you were," replied Billy. "He is desperate, in fear for his own life for failing to finish the job," said the professor. Little did anyone know that very man was watching them from the hilltop, and he was not alone.
I just wanna love you, just wanna hold you, just wanna be with you till we grow old. Please tell me you'll stay or take. I just wanna love you, just wanna hold you.
This is an audio-visual story of a heart-wrenching tale set in the 18th century. Get ready to embark on a journey of love, sacrifice and heartache of the unbreakable bond of true love. Episode 7. When the Heart Feels Anger. Charlie arrived in England and made his way to the home of George the doorman. On arriving at the house, Charlie was greeted by George's wife. "My dear Master Charlie, it is so good to see you after all these years." "Hello, Beth. It is good to see you as well, even if for a little while I need to speak with George," replied Charlie. "He is with his brother at the White Swan Inn." Charlie thanked Beth and proceeded to the Swan Inn, which was only 2 streets away from the house. As he walked in, he could see George sitting by the fireplace with a beer in one hand and his pipe in the other, talking to his brother. As Charlie walked up to the table, George looked up. "Bless me if it isn't Master Charlie. When did you get back and—" "Why?" "I had to come back on business," replied Charlie. George then turned to his brother and said, "Jack, fetch Master Charlie a whiskey, and for us as well. Sit down, sir, and tell me what brings you to see me." "Remember, on the day I was leaving, you told me that my mother had found something that could bring down my father, but no one knew what it was or where it was, as she died a few days after telling you and Uncle Carl," replied Charlie in a sort of half-excited, half-anxious voice. "That I do, Master Charlie. I only thought it was right that you knew your mother was seeing your father for what he is, the devil walking among us." Charlie then pulled out the document from inside his coat pocket and passed it over to George, who opened it, then took one quick look, folding it back up fast, and said, "We need to take this to someone who will know what to do." They got up just as Jack returned with the whiskey. "Hey, where are you going in such a hurry?" "Sorry, Jack. I need to take Master Charlie to his hotel, and I think you can manage to drink all 3, replied George, laughing. They then left the Swan and made their way to the captain's hotel. Once inside, George asked if they could let the captain know he was there. They were told to go up to the captain's suite, George knocked on the door, and John opened it and asked them to come in. "Gentlemen, this is Master Charlie, Edward's brother," announced George. "Good to see you, Charlie," said Carl. "It's been a long time, my dear uncle," replied Charlie. "Sir, remember your cousin before her death mentioned a document that could bring her husband's money plan down, and we didn't know where it was. I have in my hand that very same document," said George in an excited voice. "Where in the devil did you find it, George?" remarked Carl. "It was not me, sir, but Master Charlie who found it in the base of an old vase. He has travelled from Hong Kong as he knew how important it can be," replied George. Charlie then began to explain what had happened and how he found the document. George passed it over to the captain, who began to read, and at the same time was almost jumping in the air. "We have got more than enough to not only destroy Lowings, but to have him hanged at the gallows. But again we need to play this powerful hand we have been given wisely, to make sure he does not slip away from justice." The captain then passed it over for Carl to read with John. At that moment, Isabella walked into the room and said, "What is all the fuss about? Why are you looking so happy?" "Miss Isabella, we have a surprise for you. Oakfield may soon be back in your hands," replied the captain. But before Isabella could say anything, Charlie stepped forward and introduced himself to Isabella. "My dear Charlie, I have heard so much about you from Edward, and how you have always protected him when he was a small child," said Isabella. Charlie laughed and said, "It has been Edward who has been looking after me for many years now." "Would you like to take Edward and George into the parlour, Miss Isabella, so you can catch up on what has been going on, the other side of the world?" asked the captain. Charlie, George and Isabella entered the parlour and closed the door behind them. The captain, Carl and John sat down to work on their next move to bring that devil Sir Arthur Lowings to his knees. It is now November 26th, and Sir Arthur and everyone from his gentlemen's club are waiting at Oakfield Manor for the arrival of the King of Spain any day now. Sir Arthur has many proposals to show the king and all to benefit Spain, himself, and everyone in the gentlemen's club, but mainly benefiting Sir Arthur. Pete Turnbull was making sure everyone knew their role in the meeting and not answering questions from the king unless told to do so. It was midday, and Sir Arthur had still to come down from his room. Turnbull knocked on Sir Arthur's door, and he heard a voice say, "Come in." As he stepped into the room, Turnbull found Sir Arthur sitting on the floor, surrounded with paper. "Is everything all right?" asked Turnbull. "I can't find the document for the shipping manifest for Cuba," replied a very agitated Sir Arthur. "It is with all the other paperwork ready for the king to sign," said Turnbull, looking very concerned. "I must have been overdoing everything. I'm beginning to forget what I'm doing. I had better be at my best when the king is here, or we may lose our heads," laughed Sir Arthur. In the kitchen, Mary was very busy making sure everything was prepared for the king's visit. She had extra staff to help her with everything, and nothing was being left to chance by Sir Arthur. He wanted everything to be perfect for the king. Sir Arthur and Turnbull entered the study to have one last meeting before the royal guest arrived. The meeting was going well. Sir Arthur was in a good mood, which made it easier for the others to relax and not worry about upsetting him. It was 2:15 when one of the bank's runners arrived at the house with urgent news. Pete Turnbull was passed a letter by the runner and began to read. He almost dropped to the floor when he read the news. Turnbull rushed to the study, made his way to Sir Arthur and said in a shaking voice, "The Spanish king is dead." Sir Arthur looked up and laughed, then asked if had Turnbull been drinking. "No, sir, the king died yesterday, and we have just received the news," replied Turnbull. Sir Arthur fell back into his chair and said nothing, not even when the room erupted with everyone wanting to know what was going to happen, as everything was planned for the king's visit. Some men were demanding their money back, and others began to leave the room. All the while Sir Arthur just sat in his chair, with his head in his hands, and said nothing. It took a few minutes for Sir Arthur to react. He slammed his hand on the table, then in a loud voice said, "One setback and you panic and scurry away like rats from a sinking ship. You all seem to have forgotten. We still have Colombia and the Caribbean in our grasp. Pull yourself together and sit down so we can work on a new plan for making us rich and more powerful than ever." One by one they returned to the study and sat down. Pete Turnbull brought the others who left the room back and told them to sit down. After everyone settled down, Sir Arthur began to tell them, with or without the king, they could still make part of the plan work, together with the plan to obtain coffee, sugar, and gold. "Lord John, have you still got your contacts in Colombia and America?" asked Sir Arthur. "Yes, and I have a man we can trust in Cuba," replied Lord John. "Excellent. Now we can work on the cargo of sugar while Spain is grieving over their king. Send the ships out with the trade goods. Write a letter to your man in Cuba, explaining exactly what I tell you, and send it with the ships. You need to make sure the cargo will leave for Cuba on the next tide. They are ready to leave England at any time," asked Sir Arthur, turning towards Turnbull. "Yes, sir, they have been on standby, ready to set sail for the last 4 days," replied Turnbull. "Excellent. Well, gentlemen, we are ready to make history and get very rich by doing so," said Sir Arthur, feeling pleased with himself. The room erupted with applause and cheers. It shows that no matter what setbacks there are, when it comes to money, people will forget any problems they had, because greed and power will always walk hand in hand. Karl was in a meeting with the British Prime Minister at Buckingham Palace. They were talking about the situation with Sir Arthur, and how he has and is using the government and the Bank of England for his purpose. They were making sure they had everything in order to present to the Queen. There are things such as this, the Queen would like to know, as it involves the Empire and matters of the state. It also looks bad to the rest of the known world if England allows its members of Parliament to twist the law of England to their own needs. The two men had been talking and working out the best way to deal with Sir Arthur for an hour when Prince Albert walked into the room. Both men stood up and greeted the prince. "Gentlemen, I can see you are busy, and I can only guess it's an important one by the look of all the documents," remarked the prince. "It is a most difficult situation we are trying to solve before presenting it to the Queen," replied the Prime Minister. "Indeed it must be, as I have never seen the two of you working together before, which reminds me, my mother wishes to see you in her library, Prime Minister." As the Prime Minister left the room, Karl asked the prince if he could spare a moment to discuss a personal matter regarding Oakfield Manor. On hearing the words, Oakfield, the prince suddenly had a look of contentment about him. "Ah, those were happy times. I spent many summer days with my friend Henry Oakfield. He was more like a brother to me. The mischief we used to get up to, I remember his older sister Margaret, and at the time I was besotted with her, which is silly now I think about it, me being a small child and her being almost a grown woman. How life and times fly by." Karl proceeded to tell the prince about the ring and what had happened to Lady Margaret, and about the house, and how the ring is now in the possession of Isabella. The prince listened very carefully to everything Karl had to say. Then when the captain was mentioned, he sat up and moved forward from his chair and said, "If the captain is involved, then it must be of great importance. As for the other matter regarding Oakfield Manor, I will honour the meaning of the ring, and as for Lady Margaret's brother's daughter Isabella, she has nothing to fear. She will be the Lady of Oakfield, of that you have my word." It was then that Karl handed the prince the letter Lady Margaret had written to Isabella, and also showed him Lady Margaret had written to the prince in the same letter. After a few minutes of reading the letter, the prince looked up and said, "As you probably know, I am in a way connected to Oakfield, so when I can, I wish to make an informal visit soon. Your Highness, you may do as you wish after we find the best way of dealing with this Arthur Lowings." The prince agreed with Karl that it would be better to deal with this quietly and not cause a scandal. The prince was about to leave the room when he turned and said, "This Lowings fellow, did he make his son look like he had betrayed the Queen and the nation by trading without an agreement with Spain?" "Yes, Your Highness, and by making his son a wanted man, it meant that the government could control his money and estate, or I should say, Edward's father could. I'm beginning to see this Lowings is pure evil, especially when he is using his own family for his greed. Has that man no soul?" replied the prince. "No, Your Highness, he has been called the devil who walks among us. Devil or not, he is still a man, and any man who will stoop to such low levels for himself and greed will be punished, if not in this life but the next," snapped the prince, who turned and left the room. Charlie and Isabella were visiting Hyde Park before Charlie set sail in 2 days for his trip to Hong Kong. "So both you and Edward came here to talk and enjoy some time together?" asked Isabella. "Yes, we have always come here to watch nature and the people going about their daily lives. We have been since Edward was small after Mother died. She used to bring us here to observe people and teach us the meaning that not everything is about money, but being happy with what you have," replied Charlie. "Your mother was wise and loving. I can tell just by the smile on your face, Charlie, that they were happy times for you," remarked Isabella. "They were the best times for Edward and myself because we had time to be with our mother for a few hours once a week," said Charlie with a touch of sadness on his face. Charlie then lifted his head and with a big smile on his face asked Isabella in a cheeky voice, "So Isabella, tell me how and why you got married so fast after meeting Edward. said Charlie, grinning. Isabella smiled and said, "I can only tell you that when the heart knows the bond is true, there is no reason to wait. It was Lady Margaret who suggested we get married on the ship. We were going to wait until we arrived in England. As it turned out, Lady Margaret had other ideas, and Edward saw no reason not to get married on the ship. As for me, I just knew I wanted to be with Edward for the rest of my life." "There is one thing I still don't fully understand. Why did Edward not want anyone to know about the marriage?" asked Charlie. "Edward agreed with Lady Margaret that for the interest of both of us, it would be better not to mention anything even to his father until Edward had placed all his plans for the future in place and Lady Margaret had made arrangements for us to live at Oakfield," replied Isabella. Charlie then clapped his hands and said, "Now I understand Lady Margaret must have known about Lord Kemp's daughter and Edward." "What do you mean? Edward was going to marry Lord Kemp's daughter?" asked Isabella. "No. Our father had a dinner party with the intention of announcing the marriage, but Edward would have none of it and walked out on father and out of the room," replied Charlie. "That is what Lord Kemp meant when he said Edward is an honourable man by doing what he did. Lord Kemp was referring to the dinner party," said Isabella with a big smile on her face. They then sat talking for another hour before going to lunch and then heading back to the hotel. The captain and John are busy making a list of all the members of Parliament and the Bank of England who invested in Sir Arthur's money and power plan and who were not in his gentleman's club. They are the weak links and can be pressured to back out. As for those in Sir Arthur's elite club, it has been advised to leave them alone by order of the palace. The Queen wants them to be brought to their knees with quick justice, no matter their title or rank. The palace and the Prime Minister have given the captain and Carl complete control to achieve justice in the name of the Crown. "We will start with these members of Parliament. They have the most to lose and not just money," said the captain. "We have all we need on those from the bank. It will be easy to have them back out. 3 have large debts and no money, and the other 2 have used their family's money to invest in the land in Norfolk. So we will offer them the same amount they invested. In return, they will back out of the plan," said the captain. "I have a list of all of those not in the gentleman's club that we can bring together at the same time to present our proposal, to back out of Sir Arthur's plans," replied John. "Good. Now we need to inform Carl and arrange a meeting with everyone in the same room. I see the total is 15. That is going to work in our favour, especially having Carl there to explain what will happen if they don't. That will scare them into giving up their interest in Sir Arthur's plans," explained the captain. Edward and the professor were sitting on a log outside by the hut, talking about what could happen in England regarding Isabella and the captain, when Billy walked up to them and asked if they knew they were being watched. Edward shook his head, but the professor looked at Billy and held up 4 fingers. Billy nodded. "Good. He hasn't managed to gain any more support. It has been almost 3 weeks since the attack. That is plenty of time to find more men. I think he is planning his next move carefully, and he will have to make his move in the next few days." "How the hell? Did you know he was watching us and that he was not alone?" asked Edward. The professor gave a slight smile and said, "I knew someone was watching us when one night I was sitting here around 2 in the morning last week, and I got a strong smell of cheap cherry pipe tobacco. And as far as I know, there is only one place in the world that sells that tobacco with that sickly sweet cherry smell, and that's Hudson's Imported Tobacco Shop by the docks in London," replied the professor, who went on to say, "It was the next night I went around to the top of the hill and watched 2 of them watching the hut. I stayed until I saw the one who shot you, and another local man change places with the 2 who were watching during the night. Once I saw him, I knew there were only 4 of them, but was not sure if I had missed anyone, until Billy just confirmed there are 4. "So what will we need to do?" asked Edward. "Nothing for now," replied the professor. Later that day, Edward was busy repairing a fishing boat. He looked up to see a few local fishing boats casting their nets. Edward was thinking of Isabella and how she loved to watch the boats come ashore full of all different fish. Edward was about to carry on working on the boat when he looked up again and noticed some men in a small fishing boat casting a net. Anyone else watching would not think anything of it. But Edward noticed there were 5 men in the boat, not the normal 2 or 3 fishermen. Just then, the professor walked over to Edward and said, "Do you need help with this boat?" in a low voice, then said, "Don't look too hard, my friend. You will get sore eyes. And yes, before you say anything, I noticed the 5 men in the fishing boat, and if you're thinking they are not fishermen, you are right. Carry on as normal. I will stay here for a while with you. I need to work out what sort of reason they have for being here." The 2 men carried on repairing the boat when Billy and his wife approached them. "Professor, Master Edward, we will be going to the farm for a few days to check the crops. Very good, Billy. And while you are there, remember to try the new water system we set up the other week, replied Edward. I will, sir, and thank you for all you have done on the farm, especially getting the best prices for my produce, remarked Billy. Think nothing of it, Billy. I'm very happy to help in any way, replied Edward. Billy shook Edward and the professor's hands and left for the farm with his wife. We can expect the men on the hill to make their move any time now, so we need to carry on as if nothing is wrong and stick to the plan. As long as we have the advantage, we will be fine, said the professor. I don't think they will do anything while everyone is in the village, Edward remarked. No, but there is a festival in 2 days. Everyone will be in the town celebrating, said the professor. So for now, we act normal and just carry on as if it is just another day. It is the day of the festival. We will need to keep our eyes and ears open to anything and everything not normal. Like before, but without watching a grown man play like a child, laughed Edward. That made the professor burst out laughing. No, not this time. I don't think that would work a second time, chuckled the professor. At Oakfield, the day was anything but normal. Sir Arthur had news a few days before that the Colombian government would not entertain the idea of Sir Arthur's plan to mine for gold and trade coffee. The plan to have sole trading rights for the sugar from Cuba has been put into place after a lot of bribes and promises. All the setbacks have been taking their toll on Sir Arthur, who is looking older and tired. It was a very cold and wet morning when Mary, soaking wet, ran into the house and saw Pete Turnbull. "Hurry, master, Sir Arthur is outside in the rain and acting very strange," said Mary in a hurried voice. Turnbull and the butler rushed into the garden, where they saw Sir Arthur standing in the water fountain, dressed as Neptune, demanding the rain stop. They managed to get him out and wrap a coat around him. All the while he was telling the rain he was their god, and the rain must obey his command. Turnbull noticed Sir Arthur had been drinking, and was too drunk to even notice anyone was with him. They got Sir Arthur back to the house and dried him off before putting him to bed. Pete Turnbull called Mary and the butler into the kitchen and told them not to talk to anyone about what happened that day if they wished to continue to work and stay healthy. Both Mary and the butler knew exactly what Turnbull meant and agreed to say nothing. It was the next day Sir Arthur was back to his normal self, giving orders and generally being in a bad mood. He was in the study when Turnbull walked in with an unexpected visitor, and before Turnbull could introduce the guest, Sir Arthur raised his hands in the air and shouted, "My, you are a sight for sore eyes, and with good timing as well. How is my old friend the Fixer?" asked an excited Sir Arthur. Standing in front of Sir Arthur was the captain, but Sir Arthur only knew him as the Fixer, after all the deals the captain had done many years ago to gain Sir Arthur's trust. "I am well, thank you, Sir Arthur. I was in London and went to ask for you, as I have a deal that may interest you. So I went to the house only to be told you are living here by your doorman, so here I am, ready to help my old friend make some money," replied the captain. "What a blessing. You have come at the right time, as a few deals out of my control fell apart. Please sit down and let us talk about this plan of yours. I remember the last one. I made a lot of money out of that and managed to get my seat as a member of Parliament from that as well. And all thanks to you, my friend." Pete Turnbull was surprised to see Sir Arthur in such an excitable mood. It was something he had never seen before, and to him that meant this friend of Sir Arthur's could be trusted. If just merely walking into the room could make Sir Arthur behave like that. The two men sat and talked for over 2 hours when Sir Arthur called for the cook. Mary walked into the room. Sir Arthur said, "Mary, please prepare something very special for dinner. I have a very dear friend staying for a few days, and I would like him to have a taste of what the best meal in all of Surrey tastes like." Mary looked up and was surprised to see the captain sitting with Sir Arthur, but she showed no emotion. Mary said she would start right away on making something special for the occasion. That seemed to make Sir Arthur even more in a good mood. The two men carried on talking for a while, and then the captain produced a letter with a plan to buy some land which has gold waiting to be dug out of the mountains, as well as silver and copper. The land was in Australia and ready for the right buyer, and being under British rule and in his capacity as a member of Parliament, it would be easy to obtain the land and keep all profit and not pay tax. Sir Arthur had an expression on his face as a child would after receiving his Christmas presents. He was happy and excited about the idea. "Now that is the way to go. I will have that land in my hands by the end of the week. Now tell me, what have you been up to after all these years?" asked Sir Arthur. The captain then started to talk about his adventures, always making sure it involved money and lots of it. He found many years ago that if you talk about money to Sir Arthur, he will listen intently. It was the day of the local festival, and the whole village dressed for the occasion and went into the town to celebrate, which meant Edward and the Professor were alone in the village. It was about 2 p.m. when the Professor told Edward to watch the back of the hut. It was only a few minutes before Edward said, "They are moving in this way from the tree line. There are 5, the Professor said, and those 5 in the fishing boat are moving onto the shore, so we have 10 to deal with. Keep a lookout from the sides." Edward and the Professor moved to a side room with a trapdoor on the floor ready to make a run for the trees. The men on the beach opened fire, a volley of shots at the hut, and both Edward and the Professor dived to the floor. Then they heard men shouting and more shots fired. Then the sound of metal on metal. The Professor looked at Edward, and both of them made a run for the trees. As they were running, the Professor stopped and turned to see the men fighting with some other men. He called to Edward to stay in the trees. He then ran to the fighting, ready to cut a few men to the ground, when he saw another group of men running towards the fight. The situation looked hopeless until he heard some men shouting in Spanish and realized he had people fighting on his side. It was all over within minutes from the first shots fired. Still looking puzzled, he went over to the men who greeted him as an old friend. Still a little confused about what just happened, he started to look for the last man out of the 7 who was sent by Edward's father. A look of horror came across his face when he realized he was not among the dead. The Professor turned and started to run as fast as he could towards where Edward was waiting. As he approached the trees, there was a loud crack, and he saw Edward stagger out of the trees holding a pistol. The Professor ran up to Edward to see if he was all right. "I am fine, just a little shaken up." He came out of nowhere and was about to use his knife when there was a loud crack sound. The next thing I remember was him dropping to the ground with a hole in his head. "I must have pulled the trigger without thinking," said Edward. "That's all right, my friend. You can take the credit for the kill." Both the Professor and Edward looked as if they had seen a ghost. "Otto, what the blazes are you doing here?" asked a shocked Edward. "My friend, did I not tell you before? Your friends in Colombia are looking out for you as you are a very important asset to them. I arrived with a few of the President's men. He sent them to aid you in fighting for justice." The Professor told Otto that if he had not turned up the way he did, both Edward and himself would probably be dead. The President would not let that happen, especially after what happened to you both the last time. When the President found out about the attack, he sent word to me to protect you without revealing myself, but today there was no choice. "Well, you are a sight for sore eyes, Otto, and this is a day I will never forget what you did for us," replied Edward. They moved the bodies into a few boats, and then the Colombian men took them out to sea to dispose of the bodies. Otto told Edward and the Professor to be ready to set sail for England in the morning. "How is that possible? Edward is still a wanted man in England, thanks to his father," said the Professor. "There have been a few changes, and all for the good, I hasten to add. But for now I can tell you that Edward is no longer a wanted man, but we still need to be careful, as we don't know who else has been paid to kill Edward," replied Otto. Back at the hotel, Isabella and John were enjoying talking and remembering the happy times everyone had when Lady Margaret was alive. "John, I've often wondered why you stayed at Oakfield for so long," asked Isabella. John smiled and said, "After Lady Margaret's brother died, the captain and I were packing his things to ship home when there were 3 letters in a writing box, one for Lady Margaret, one for the captain, and one for me. In my letter, your father asked me to stay with Lady Margaret, so I could protect you until I knew you would no longer need my protection." "Is that why you never married?" asked a giggling Isabella. This made John blush. "My work kept me busy, and so did you when you were very young, making me chase you all around the house and spending hours looking for you in the garden, while all the time you were in the kitchen eating pie or cake," laughed John. This made Isabella laugh even more, and then she said, "I always thought you and Mary would marry. I know she is sweet on you, and you are sweet on her, but neither of you makes it obvious. Mary is a fine woman, and would make any man a happy man," replied John. "Then make that man you, Master John. You are perfect for each other," said an excited Isabella. John changed the subject to talk about her and Edward's plans for the future. "I would love to go back to Oakfield and enjoy knowing Lady Margaret can rest in peace with Edward and myself there, and not Edward's devil of a father, but I must admit, being in Jamaica with Edward, I felt I was home and very happy to just enjoy life without thinking what to wear or which hat is in fashion. It is a good life, "I will agree, Miss Isabella, and one I am thinking of doing myself once this messy business is over," replied John. At that moment there was a knock at the door. John told Isabella to go into the other room. John opened the door and was greeted by a very well-dressed man, who presented himself as the secretary to Prince Albert, and then handed John a leather pouch, told John that he will return in 1 hour to collect the documents. John shut the door and called Isabella into the room. "It looks like we have something from Prince Albert." John opened the pouch, untied the seal, and began to read. Then after a few minutes turned to Isabella and said, "Edward is no longer a wanted man for breaking our government's trade agreement with Spain, as the trade was part of a deal with the Colombian government towards independence. The document also states that as soon as it is possible, Oakfield Manor and the estate are to be returned to Isabella Lowings, daughter to Lord Henry Oakfield and adopted daughter of the late Lady Margaret, now the said wife of Edward Lowings. Isabella Lowings from this day has been bestowed the title of Lady Isabella. I don't believe what I am hearing. I am now the Lady of Oakfield Manor. Edward is no longer a wanted man. Lady Margaret is still looking after me," Isabella said in a shocked but emotional voice. "There is more. In recognition for many years of service to the Crown and its government, John Hamilton will be given a pension of no less than £10,000 a year for life, and will be known from this day forward as Sir John, after the formalities." John looked up and was visibly shocked. "I haven't done anything to deserve any of this. I'm not part of the gentry. I will be like a fish out of water," remarked John. Now, Sir John, that's not the attitude," laughed Isabella. John went red just hearing the words, "Sir John." "I can't accept this, Miss Isabella. I am not of high breeding." "Neither was that Sir Arthur, but he managed it, and so can you. Think of how proud Lady Margaret would be if she was here now," replied Isabella. "There is one thing I want to know that has confused me for a long time. What is the connection between Lady Margaret, the ring, and the prince?" asked Isabella. John looked at Isabella as if he had been waiting for this question. "It started many years ago when your father was a child. His mother was one of the best governess, teaching everything from reading and writing to Latin, and the prince was one of her students. Your father was 3 years older than the prince, but used to help the prince with his schoolwork. They became great friends, but more like brothers than friends. From what I remember, your father was 18 when he joined the army as a low-ranking officer. The prince had 2 identical rings made, one for your father and one for himself. Your father once told me that the ring symbolized a true bond of brotherhood. Now I understand why the ring was so special to Lady Margaret, because of the bond between the prince and her brother." Both Isabella and John signed the document and returned the pouch when the prince's secretary arrived. It was exactly 1 hour when there was a knock at the door. The same man was standing there with his hand open, waiting for the document. John passed it over. The man checked to see if it was signed. He gave a slight smile, and then handed John a second document. But this time the man simply turned around and left. John closed the door and began to read. "What is this one about John?" asked Isabella. "What it is saying is that Sir John Hamilton will be the new British governor of Jamaica, starting in the new year." "That is amazing news, John, and it also starts you off on your dream of living there. Will you take Mary with you?" asked an excited Isabella. John laughed. "One thing at a time," he said. They then carried on talking about what just happened and what the future has in store for them. The captain was getting ready to go down for breakfast when he looked out of the window and noticed Sir Arthur outside. It looked like he was talking to himself while pacing up and down, when suddenly Sir Arthur was shouting at someone, but there was no one there. The captain heard Sir Arthur shout, "Leave me alone. You are dead, and your soul is in the river. Go away. Don't make me have you killed again." Then there was silence when Turnbull went to help Sir Arthur back into the house. The captain entered the breakfast room and found Sir Arthur sitting there waiting for him, and in a jolly mood. "Please sit and have some of this wonderful coffee, and do help yourself to anything you wish to eat. I have a feeling that today will be a good day." "I do believe it will be, judging by your good mood, Sir Arthur," replied the captain. The 2 men talked for an hour, then walked in the garden. It was a crisp winter morning. The ground was covered in frost, making a cracking sound underfoot when walking. They had walked for about 20 minutes when Sir Arthur stopped and pointed to the family crypt. "There is the resting place of the most stubborn woman I have ever known," remarked Sir Arthur, who went on to say, "I had a lot of people depending on her selling some land in Norfolk, but she was stubborn right from the start, until the day she died." The captain asked, So the lady died of old age. You could say that, but sometimes you have to give God a helping hand to get what you want, said Sir Arthur with a laugh. The captain had to use all his strength not to do anything rash after hearing this. Let us return to the house and see if we can find another money-making idea between us, just like we had done in the past, said Sir Arthur. The two men returned to the house to work on new ideas to make more money for Sir Arthur and his gentleman's club. It was around 3 in the afternoon when they were interrupted by Pete Turnbull with a message for Sir Arthur. Sir, I have just received word from my man in London. May I have a word with you in private, sir? You can talk freely in front of my friend. If it's bad news or good, my friend will find a way to resolve any issues regarding problems, replied Sir Arthur. As you wish, sir. I have been told that some of the investors have backed out and demanding the money back, Turnbull said in an agitated voice. So a few backed out, it is not a problem. We can cover what we will lose from a few of them backing out. It is them who will regret their decision later when we make a fortune, said Sir Arthur, laughing. How many did we lose? Turnbull did not feel comfortable telling Sir Arthur exactly how many wanted their money back. All told, with those from Parliament and the bank, 15, said Turnbull. Sir Arthur went white as a sheet. On hearing how many had backed out of his plans, Sir Arthur's face changed from laughter to anger. He stood up and in a rage shouted, 15! Who are they? And why now are they all backing out at the same time? I have a list of names ready for you, sir, said a very worried Turnbull. Sir Arthur looked at the names and turned to Turnbull. It looks like there will be a lot of accidents from now and the new year. See to it, Turnbull. You know the best ways when dealing with these types of people, said an angry Sir Arthur. It was then the captain said, Sir Arthur, if you do that just after you received the news, it could fall back on you. There only needs to be a few accidents to happen to make the others talk, which could bring suspicion to your door. Sir Arthur sat down, then said, You are right, my friend. It will come back to me if the others talk. I apologize. I was not thinking straight. The captain deep inside was smiling. The plan to have Carl explain to the 15 investors what would happen to them if they continued to invest with Sir Arthur had worked. The captain had noticed a change in Sir Arthur now and then. One moment he was fine, the next he would do something rash, like talk to a chair or try to catch a fish with a spoon. It seems Sir Arthur comes and goes in and out of these moments, and it seems since Sir Arthur received the news about the investors backing out of his plan, the refusal of trade of gold and coffee from Colombia, the death of the King of Spain, altogether seems to be too much for him. But then, when Sir Arthur is feeling good, he is twice as determined to find a new way to make money and to stop his gentleman's club falling apart. The captain has been staying at Oakfield now for 3 days, and today Sir Arthur will be in a good mood, as this is the day he will have the land in Australia in his hands. Sir Arthur has already made plans for a few of Pete Turnbull's men to go to Australia, with money to set up a mining camp and hire some local men to dig the mines. It was early morning when Sir Arthur heard the news he had got the land in Australia. This made him very happy. It made him that happy he gave the captain a gold pocket watch as a thank you. Both the captain and Sir Arthur were in the study, celebrating getting the land in Australia. Well, my dear friend, you pulled it off again by passing me information that will help fill my pockets with gold, said a delighted Sir Arthur. I knew this was right for you from the moment I found out the land was for sale, replied the captain. This calls for a celebration feast with the best food for such an occasion. I would like you to try a delightful dish that Mary has been making for me for months. It has my favorite mushrooms and the best ingredients that nature has to offer, with the best lamb cuts. I would like to try that, Sir Arthur. It sounds very appetizing. It is almost making me hungry thinking about it. This made both men burst out laughing. Edward and the professor were ready for the journey back to England and were waiting for Billy to return to say their goodbyes. Billy arrived an hour before the ship's departure. Master Edward, I heard what happened and was happy to hear you and the professor were unharmed. Yes, it was fate that night that kept the professor and myself safe. Now, Billy, I will be back one day, but before then, I have left something for you and your wife in the hut. It is my way of saying thank you for everything, said a very grateful Edward. The 3 men shook hands, and then Edward and the professor boarded the ship. Otto was already waiting for them on deck. Gentlemen, are you ready to go back to England with your heads held high? Asked Otto. Yes, but more importantly, I can hold my wife in my arms once more and look into her eyes and tell her how much I love her, replied Edward. The ship had been at sea for a few days, and in that time the 3 men talked a lot about what had happened in England and Jamaica. Otto told Edward about his father's plan to take over the coffee and gold trade in Colombia, using Edward's permission documents signed by the Colombian president, and how the president said no to all offers from Edward's father. Otto went on to tell Edward and the professor how the captain had made a plan to bring his Sir Arthur to justice, but not for the death of Lady Margaret or anyone else's deaths he may have had a hand in. There was no real evidence to use that against him. Otto went on to give a list of crimes Sir Arthur was involved with that could be used against him. The list ranged from abusing his power as a member of the Parliament to forcibly taking land and using the Bank of England as his very own moneymaker, using blackmail and fear in doing so. The professor turned to Edward and said, "What I am about to tell you is going to hurt very much and cause you to be very angry, but the captain said you will need to know when the time is right." Edward looked shocked on hearing those words. "What is it that could make me hurt so badly and angry?" replied Edward. "Almost a year to this very day, the captain and John came to see me near the docks. They were looking for someone. That person just happened to use opium, and this excuse for a man was in the same building when they came to see me. He died from taking too much opium, but not before he was able to point to his coat. In the coat was a letter that was not signed or mentioned any names. The captain, John and I believe your father was not only responsible for the death of Lady Margaret, but also his first wife. We believe after meeting your mother and making her fall in love with him, he tried to divorce his first wife to marry your mother, but she would not give him a divorce, and a few days later she died in a fire while asleep. I can't believe what I'm hearing, but in a way I'm not surprised," remarked Edward. The professor went on to say, "Edward, there is a very strong possibility that in some way your father is responsible for your mother's death. It was strange that your father came into possession your mother's estate in Germany and had control of your mother's family's money, only a few days after your mother's death. Edward had a look of anger about him when he heard his father may have killed his mother. It was a look neither Otto nor the professor had seen before. Edward said in an angry voice, "If he did have anything to do with my mother's death, I will personally put the rope around his neck and pull the lever."
I just wanna love you, just wanna hold you, just wanna be with you till we grow old. Please tell me you'll stay or take me away. I want you for myself every single. I just wanna love you, just wanna hold.
This is an audio-visual story of a heart-wrenching tale set in the 18th century. Get ready to embark on the concluding journey of love, sacrifice and heartache of the unbreakable bond of true love. Episode 8, Unexpected Justice. It was early evening when the banquet started. Sir Arthur had invited everyone from his gentleman's club to attend. Everyone was sitting around the dinner table, drinking, eating and having a good time. Sir Arthur had made a speech about how things were turning around in their favour and that they had nothing to worry about, as the money would be coming in faster than they could spend it. The main meal was brought in. There was pork, beef, lamb and duck, which was plenty for everyone to choose from. The captain and Sir Arthur had a special dish that was made just for them, as it was Sir Arthur's favourite. "Ah, this looks fit for a king," said Sir Arthur. "I must admit it does look good and smells wonderful," said the captain. "Wait until you taste it. You will think you have died and gone to heaven," replied Sir Arthur. The captain took a few bites, looked up and said, "You are right, it tastes unbelievably good. It is like spring and summer all at the same time, with so much flavour." "I knew you would like it, as you have the same mind about things as I do. We have a bond in such things," said Sir Arthur. The captain had to give a little smile because he knew that Sir Arthur could not have been so far off the truth. They may agree on a lot of things in Sir Arthur's mind, but not the captain's, as that was fixed on justice, for all the evil things Sir Arthur had done over the years. After dinner, everyone sat in the large parlour, drinking and talking. The captain was talking to Sir Arthur about the time he was helping him find the money to get into Parliament, and how the captain thought he was dealing with a man who would do well in life. Sir Arthur loved to hear such things said about himself, and this made him feel more relaxed and open, with a little help from the whiskey. "Did you know, my friend, I was beginning to think I was alone until you turned up like an angel to help me in my hour of need," said Sir Arthur. "You're not alone, Sir Arthur. You have your 2 sons to be with you," replied the captain. "I have no sons. One has run away with his family to God knows where, and the other died in another country." The captain was a little concerned to hear that Edward may be in trouble, but knowing the professor was with him, put the captain's mind at ease. "I am sorry to hear that, my friend. It must have been hard to lose your sons like that," replied the captain. "There is nothing to grieve about. One was weak and timid, and the other one I disowned a long time ago. He was stubborn like his mother. So it just goes to show that at times a man is best on his own," said Sir Arthur. It was late into the night when everyone retired to their rooms for the night. The next morning, some of the guests had already left for London, leaving a few behind to enjoy more free food and drink. The captain was walking in the garden before breakfast when he heard a commotion coming from one of the stables. He quickly made his way to the noise and found Sir Arthur hitting a horse with a shovel across its head and cursing the horse at the same time. The captain quickly took the shovel away from Sir Arthur and said, "What in the hell is wrong that he was hitting a horse so violently?" Sir Arthur did not respond at first. He was too busy talking to the horse, saying, "You are nothing but a stubborn old woman, so don't lecture me about life. I have had enough of your condescending talking about right and wrong. I am glad I had you dealt with." Just then Pete Turnbull arrived. "Sir, you are having those visions again. Try to calm down and relax. Your friend and I are here for you, sir. Look at me, remember it is me, Turnbull." Sir Arthur stopped talking and just looked at both men with a wild look about him. He then slumped to the floor and began to weep like a frightened child. The two men helped Sir Arthur to his feet and took him back to the house, but this time through the kitchen to the stable hand's room to rest. "I will stay with him," said Turnbull. "Please don't mention what happened to the others. Sir Arthur will be okay after an hour or so." "You have my word. I will not mention what happened." "What has made Sir Arthur turn into a half-demented madman?" asked the captain. "I think he has put too much stress on himself trying to please everyone in making money, and all the setbacks have weighed heavy on his mind," said a worried Turnbull. The captain left to return to his room. Once in his room, he sat down to try and work out what had been triggering Lowing's strange behavior. He could only think that he had been overworking his mind and had reached the point where he was seeing things that others cannot, as he had seen Lowing's before in the garden, talking and then shouting to someone who was not there. The one thing he had noticed was that it seemed nothing new to Pete Turnbull. The captain had to find out more by talking to Turnbull. It is now January 4th, 1886, and Edward, the professor, and Otto are a day away from arriving in England. "We will go to the captain's hotel once we dock and find out what has happened while we were away," said the professor. "I will come with you both to the hotel. I will need to speak to my father. I also think it would be in your interest if you talk to him as well, Edward," replied Otto. "Yes, it would be good to see my uncle again," said Edward. "There is one thing. You may not know, Lord Kemp has had a big hand in almost everything to bring your father down. Lord Kemp and Lord Peterson pulled out from backing your father, especially when they both found out that your father had mistaken Isabella for a maid, and also Lord Kemp was not happy that he was made to look a fool by your father in thinking you wanted the marriage between his daughter and yourself. Once Lord Kemp found out, it was your father's way to gain a hold of Lord Kemp's money and estate. He made sure he and Lord Peterson pulled out of any deals your father had," said Otto. "And now it all makes sense why my father allowed the announcement to be made at that dinner party. He planned it all along," replied Edward. The captain was with Pete Turnbull. They were walking to the stables to check on the horse Sir Arthur attacked. Along the way, the captain asked Turnbull how long Sir Arthur had these visions he talked about. "They started about a few months back. I noticed Sir Arthur was forgetting things, especially words. Then about a month ago, he started talking to someone who was not there, and he would suddenly think he was one of the Greek or Roman gods." "I see. So do you think it is from stress and overwork that has made Sir Arthur behave like that?" asked the captain. "Yes, sir. He has been doing everything to get to what he desires most of all, and he is almost there. I feel with you being here, and with your help, he will achieve that desire," replied Turnbull. "I will do all I can to help Sir Arthur achieve his dream, whatever that is," said the captain. Turnbull looked at the captain with a slight smile and said, "A lord, sir." "Sir Arthur wants to be Lord Arthur, and a very rich lord at that," said Turnbull with a glint in his eye. "I think I can understand now," said the captain. "If he becomes a lord, then being a lord he can claim the right to truly take over his late wife's land in Germany, which then gives him a higher title, which then gives him more open doors, including Buckingham Palace." "Maybe Sir Arthur is thinking of being the real King Arthur," joked the captain. This made Turnbull laugh out loud. "You could be right, sir," said Turnbull, still laughing. They then left the stable to return to the house, with a chuckle of laughter along the way. Carl arrived at the hotel with instructions from the Prime Minister and the palace. "John, Isabella, we have work to do, And since the captain is not here, we need to make sure that we get everything right, Carl said in a determined voice. Yes, of course we will. But what can I do to help? Asked Isabella. I will need you to be you, Miss Isabella. But as Lady Isabella, I will need you to have afternoon tea today with one of the directors from the bank, who is Lowing's main connection to the bank. You will need to convince him that you have been advised to invest some of your gold and also place your jewels in the bank for safekeeping. Yes, of course, I can do that. I have seen Lady Margaret do that sort of thing many times over the years, replied Isabella. I have all the paperwork for you to show Lord John when you meet this afternoon. Just be yourself, but do not mention Oakfield Manor, not until he is signed to take charge of your accounts. Then give him this letter. You can mention you are Lady Isabella of Oakfield Estate while he reads it. What will happen after I say who I am? Asked Isabella. He will probably not say anything, but will want to get away fast. And once he leaves the room, he will be taken into custody, and we have him. He will then be forced to resign from the bank and then be dealt with by whatever punishment the palace wish to impose, replied Carl. So taking away the main source of investment and income away from Lowings, the others will follow, and he will be left desperate to try to find anyone willing to invest in his plans, said John happily. Exactly. Once the first centre block is removed, the rest will topple easily, replied Carl. Isabella had a puzzled look on her face. She could not hold it in any more and asked, What is in the letter that would make the man want to run in such a way? I can only tell you that it is from the palace and the government, and that Lord John has no choice in his life anymore, as from the moment he reads that letter, he is removed from all privileges, and any title he may have, any houses and or businesses he may be involved with will be taken from him, by order of the Queen, replied Carl. Isabella entered the tea room. Lord John was waiting in the corner reading a newspaper. Isabella walked up to his table and introduced herself. John was sitting a few tables away, just in case. Lord John stood up and greeted Isabella, helped her to her seat, then sat down opposite her. After the small talk, Isabella produced a few documents for Lord John to read. After a few minutes, he put the documents down and started to explain about investing the gold in a few business ventures, which could double Isabella's money. He talked about the bank as the best place for her jewellery. It will be safe, and for only a small fee once a year. After about 30 minutes, Lord John asked if Isabella was happy to let him look after her account on her behalf, which Isabella agreed to. He then signed the document, and it was after he had handed a copy of the document to Isabella that she handed Lord John the letter. It only took a few seconds before it was obvious he was terrified of what was in the letter. He did not look at Isabella once before he got up and left the room, only to be confronted by the authorities and Carl. After Lord John realised that it was all over for him, he soon gave up the names of everyone else involved in Sir Arthur's grand plan. Carl knew that everyone on the list would be running for the hills once they knew the main man was no longer with them. "Are you okay, Miss Isabella?" asked John. "Yes, I am, and it was exciting to be able to help put that devil Sir Arthur in prison," said Isabella. At that moment, Carl entered the room. "Lady Isabella, I believe you left something in the next room," said Carl, with a serious look on his face. "I don't recall leaving anything, and I am certain I have not lost anything. What could it be, Carl?" asked Isabella. "It is best if you see for yourself, and I think you may have some explaining to do," replied Carl. Isabella was confused and worried at the same time. She started to make her way to the next room with John following behind her. Carl put his hand on John's shoulder and shook his head for John to stay in the room. Isabella entered the room and saw 3 men standing there. 2 men had their backs to Isabella reading newspapers. Isabella saw Otto and gave a small cry of delight, but before Isabella could say a word, the 2 men turned around. Isabella was in shock and almost fainted. Then she let out a big cry, "My husband!" and rushed to hold Edward. The 2 embraced each other so tight that Otto, Carl and the professor had to turn away. A very excited Isabella could not wait to tell Edward everything, but Edward, being as calm as ever, said, "Wait until we return to the room, my love." Everyone returned to the captain's suite to talk and catch up on what had been happening. There was a happy atmosphere in the suite at the hotel. Isabella, Edward, John, Carl and Otto were happy to see everyone was here and in good spirits. After about half an hour, everyone talked about what had been happening regarding Edward's father, Sir Arthur. Otto was talking to his father, Carl, about attacks on Edward and the professor in Jamaica, and how the Colombian president wanted to make sure Edward was safe. Carl was curious as to why the president was so interested in Edward's safety. Otto told his father that Edward not only found one of the biggest gold deposits in the Americas, but also found emeralds in the mountains, and gave those mines to help Colombia strengthen her independence. Everyone sees Edward as a blessing, and they all believe he was sent to provide guidance to live free. The professor and John were talking about all the deaths that Edward's father had caused over the years when Edward asked about his mother. "We don't have any solid evidence that your father had your mother killed, but we believe that he killed his first wife to marry your mother. There is a big possibility he had Lady Margaret killed as well." This made Edward almost explode with anger, until Isabella calmed him down by telling him the captain will make sure justice is done. He is out there somewhere finding the answers to all the questions. John knew where the captain was, but was told not to divulge where he was. It was getting late in the evening when there was a knock at the door. Carl opened the door and was handed a letter from the British Prime Minister. Once Carl was in the room, he sat down to read. Then, after a few minutes, looked at Isabella and said, "Thanks to you, Isabella. The corrupt Lord John gave up the names of everyone involved with Sir Arthur. Now, as from this moment, have been forcibly removed from their positions from Parliament and the Bank of England. Every single one of them has been placed in Newgate Prison, with no chance of communicating with family or friends until we have Sir Arthur in custody. It also says that there will be no courts to pass sentences, only what the Crown decides will happen to them. The less scandal, the better it is for the nation. Well, Isabella, gentlemen, I do believe we will have a victory and see the downfall of the main conspirator of corruption in our government." Edward wanted to travel overnight to confront his father at Oakfield, but Carl and the professor persuaded him against doing so, and to wait until the captain returns. They talked well into the early hours about anything and everything, but Edward, Otto and the professor never mentioned the 2 attempts on Edward's life. They didn't want to upset Isabella. Edward was very happy to hear that Isabella is now the lady of Oakfield Estate. It was then that Isabella said, "That's not the only good news, is it, Sir John?" Everyone turned to John and said, "What is this? You're a sir now." John went very red and said that both he and Isabella had a letter from the palace, that Isabella is now the rightful lady of Oakfield Estate, and that he will be Sir John after the formalities and with a pension, and in a few weeks will be the British governor in Jamaica. Edward and the others congratulated John. Carl sat very quietly with a slight smile on his face. He already knew, as it had been decided with the Prime Minister and the Queen, that it was for years of dedicated service to the government and the Crown John should be rewarded with something befitting a man of great virtue and pride for his country, his willingness to give his life to protect others. It has been 3 days since the arrest of everyone in Sir Arthur's Gentlemen's Club, and no one knew anything about it at Oakfield, not even Pete Turnbull, who knows everything that goes on in London. The captain had been noticing a change in Sir Arthur's behaviour. He was becoming more and more unpredictable in his behaviour. But the strange thing was after about maybe 20 minutes to an hour, he was back to normal, as if nothing had happened. Sir Arthur was sitting in his study when Pete Turnbull entered the room and asked him if he wanted him to arrange a meeting with the investors from the bank about a new shipment to Cuba and arrange the schedule for the gold from Australia to be collected. "That is a great idea, Pete," said Sir Arthur. This made Turnbull step back in shock. Sir Arthur had never called him by his first name, it had always been Turnbull. A rider was sent to London to pass on the information about the meeting later that day, and the captain was in the garden trying to understand what had made Sir Arthur change in a moment when he saw Turnbull talk to a rider and pass a letter to him. The captain turned to walk into the house when Turnbull saw him and called the captain to join him. "I fear that Sir Arthur is unwell. For the first time in 20 years he called me Pete. That is something he has never done," said Turnbull. "I have noticed Sir Arthur has been like the wind, calm one day then like a storm the next," replied the captain. "I just hope he will be himself when he has the meeting later with everyone," remarked Turnbull. "There's a meeting today?" asked the captain. "Yes, to discuss Cuba and the schedule for transporting the gold from Australia, which is why I am glad you are here to help calm Sir Arthur down, if he sees a vision while having the meeting," said Turnbull. The 2 men then carried on walking to the house. When the captain and Turnbull returned to the house, Sir Arthur was making his way to the dining room for lunch. He asked both men to join him. "I had Mary make my favourite dish with extra mushrooms and the best of Mother Nature's herbs. I had the same made for you as well, my friend, as I know you liked it so much the last time," said Sir Arthur, who was in a jolly mood. "Thank you, I did enjoy it very much," said the captain. "I had Mary make your favourite beef stew with thick gravy, Pete. I know you enjoy that," said a smiling Sir Arthur. The captain and Turnbull looked at each other as if they were talking to a different Sir Arthur. All 3 proceeded to the dining room, The wine was poured and the food was brought in. Sir Arthur was clapping his hands like an excited child. "Wonderful! This is food fit for a king," laughed Sir Arthur. After lunch was finished, the three men sat in the parlour talking, and everything seemed fine for an hour or so, when Sir Arthur started to look as if he was drifting to sleep, but with his eyes open. Turnbull was looking concerned and said, "I have seen that look before, just before he tried to burn down the estate church. Then we had better keep a close watch to make sure nothing like that happens again," replied the captain. A few minutes later, Sir Arthur seemed himself and carried on talking as if nothing happened, then opened a desk drawer, pulled out a gun, and shot Turnbull, shouting, "You will never have the family money. You are no son of mine." The bullet hit Turnbull's arm, which made him fall back in his chair. The captain rushed to take the gun away from him. There was a struggle, but the captain managed to take the gun. Sir Arthur just looked as if nothing had happened, went to sit down, and then noticed Turnbull lying back in the chair covered in blood. "What happened, Turnbull?" asked Sir Arthur. Turnbull got up and left the room holding his shoulder. The captain rushed to help him. "I am okay, sir. It is only a graze. I will ask Mary to tend the wound," said Turnbull. The captain returned to the room, only to find Sir Arthur, reading a letter and drinking coffee. He looked up and said, "My good friend, where have you been? You have missed lunch. Would you like a coffee?" The captain looked puzzled, as all three of them just had lunch together. Not wanting to say anything, the captain said, "Yes, thank you." He then sat down and started to talk about Sir Arthur, about the deals, and is he close to achieving his goal of becoming one of the richest and powerful men in England? This seemed to make Sir Arthur happy, as he started to talk about all his plans and ideas he had over the years. Now and then he would say something that made the captain wonder if Sir Arthur had been responsible for the death of the Member of Parliament, who Sir Arthur replaced only a few days later. The two men talked for an hour or more with no more incidents from Sir Arthur. The captain was asking about why Sir Arthur decided to go into politics when the butler arrived with a letter from the rider Turnbull sent to London. Sir Arthur took the letter and began to read it. He started to shake, not with anger, but like someone who is lost and confused. The captain took the letter and began to read. He could see that none of Sir Arthur's people from his gentleman's club was found. It was then that he knew that Carl and John had made the move to remove all the investors in Sir Arthur's plans. But how was it done, and how long ago? That is something the captain knew nothing about, only that now is the time to end this, and soon. Sir Arthur seemed to be in a daze and went to his room to rest. The captain went with him to make sure he got there. Then returning to the room, Turnbull was there reading the letter. He looked up at the captain and said, "This is bad, very bad. They all could not have just vanished into thin air. I can only think of a few reasons no one could be found. They have made run for it, or they are all in prison. But I don't think that is the case, or I would have heard about it. I can only assume that something has scared them." "They can't have gone all at once," replied the captain. Turnbull just kept looking at the letter, shaking his head, and then he said, "I have a feeling that my time here with Sir Arthur is over. I will have to seriously rethink my position here over the next few days." The next day at the hotel, Edward told Isabella to be ready to travel. John asked where was Edward going, and he replied, "To Oakfield with Isabella. I am going to confront that devil face to face, and with my wife beside me." "I will go with you," said John. "As will I," said Otto. The four of them prepared to travel to Oakfield that morning. Edward had some documents with him, and it was something John had noticed. He asked Edward, what were the documents for? "When I first arrived in England from the Americas, I went to see the Attorney General to have a contract drawn up along with 2 other documents, both of which you already know about, regarding the captain and my money. The thing is, John, I was asked to visit the attorney, and once I was there he told me about my mother's estate in Germany, and even if my father's name is on the documents, it means nothing in German law. You have to be of blood to own the estate, meaning he is not of my mother's blood, but Charlie and I are. By German law it cannot be passed from wife to husband, only the children. So does that mean you and Charlie own the estate in Germany and not your father?" "Yes, and I will take great pleasure in telling him," laughed Edward. Pete, Turnbull and the captain were in the study. Turnbull was still feeling the effect of being shot by Sir Arthur 2 days ago, and was still considering going his own way. The captain was asking if Turnbull had seen Sir Arthur since the news came about his investors. Turnbull said he had not, only heard him shouting at someone or talking to someone, but knew there was no one there. Suddenly there was the smell of smoke drifting into the room. Both men rushed out only to find thick smoke coming from upstairs. They rushed up to find where it was coming from, when Sir Arthur was standing at the top of the stairs and shouting, "You stupid old woman, you will not take back this house. It is mine now. You're dead, dead, you hear me?" Turnbull took hold of Sir Arthur and rushed him down the stairs away from the fire. The captain went to see how bad the fire was when the stable hand and the workers from the garden arrived with buckets of water. It took an hour before the fire was completely put out. After an exhausted captain came down, he found Sir Arthur curled up, rocking back and forth in Turnbull's arms, talking about seeing his dead wife and Lady Margaret, who were trying to take the house from him. The captain noticed that Sir Arthur had somehow pulled his fingernails out. His hands were blooded and swollen. It was obvious he had lost his mind. Turnbull looked up and said he had sent Mary to fetch the doctor. It was around 20 minutes when the doctor arrived, and Sir Arthur was still in the same curled-up position he was when the captain found him. The doctor examined Sir Arthur and found that he was unresponsive to anything he did, and in the doctor's opinion, for everyone's safety, Sir Arthur should be committed to an asylum, as he has reverted to being a child. The doctor left the house only to return with 4 men and a nurse. They placed the straitjacket on Sir Arthur, while all the time he was asking the nurse if he could go to the park with her and feed the ducks. He was calling the nurse mother all the time, every time he asked something. They placed Sir Arthur in a black carriage with no windows and drove away. Both Turnbull and the captain stood by the main door to watch the carriage drive off. "Well, that's it," said Turnbull. "It turns out I didn't have to think about it leaving. I know I will be leaving now." He turned to return to his room near the kitchen to collect his things when the captain said he should stay with him and find anything Sir Arthur had regarding his plans to get rich and any paperwork that could be used against Turnbull himself. "You are right. We will need to check in the study first," said a worried Turnbull. They both checked everywhere they could think of and found nothing. It was then Turnbull said, "Do you think he will get better and return to normal soon?" "It is hard to tell when it comes to the sickness of the mind," replied the captain. It was just then Turnbull remembered Sir Arthur had an iron box that was always locked in his room. The 2 men went upstairs into a still, smouldering room that smelled of smoke, and there in the corner was the iron box. The 2 men carried it downstairs into the study. The captain made short work in opening the box. Locked or not, the captain could open anything with a lock. There were a few ledgers and documents inside, and some sort of journal that was full of writing and cutting from newspapers. Turnbull was not waiting around to read anything. He grabbed as many documents as he could, and was about to throw them into the fireplace when the captain stopped him. "There may be something we can benefit from to help us become rich," said the captain. Turnbull looked, then smiled and said, "Yes, you are right. We both deserve something from all this." The captain poured a drink for them both, and they sat there drinking and talking about making money from all of this, when Turnbull fell asleep in the chair. Unknown to Turnbull, the captain had put sleeping powder in his drink. Edward and the others arrived at Oakfield, expecting trouble as soon as they arrived, only to find the captain standing at the entrance. "Welcome home, Lady Isabella," said the captain with a big smile on his face. "How did you know I am now Lady Isabella, Captain? I only found out a few days ago while you were away," said Isabella with a puzzled look on her face. John and the professor began to laugh when John said, "Miss Isabella, there is nothing the captain does not know when it comes to affairs of the state and the crown." They all greeted the captain before entering the house. The smell from the fire filled the house. "What happened?" asked Edward. The captain asked them to walk to the library to talk. Once inside, they all sat down, and the captain started to explain what had been going on since he first arrived at the house. Edward was more interested in where his father was. "Long story short, Edward, he has lost his mind, and as of this morning was taken to the asylum for his and others' safety," replied the captain. "How is that possible? He was always strong-minded and never forgot even a conversation he had from years ago," remarked Edward. "I don't know how or why it happened, Edward. I can only tell you that he had been forgetting things a lot over the last few months. I can only assume that when the deals started to collapse, that was the start of his mind playing tricks and making him forget, especially the deals he had for the King of Spain that never happened. And then, when everyone from his gentleman's club vanished, it must have been too much for his mind to handle," replied the captain. Edward and Isabella had a lot of questions to ask the captain, but the main question they wanted to know was whether Sir Arthur had Lady Margaret and Edward's mother killed. The captain took everyone to the study, where Turnbull was tied up and was still asleep. "Who is this man?" asked Isabella. "His name is Pete Turnbull. He is the man you see to have people disappear, or any dirty work you need to be done. He is the worst kind of excuse for a man. He even killed his grandfather at the age of 14, just because he wanted to feel what it was like to kill someone, replied the professor. Why is he here? Asked Edward. This is your father's right-hand man, who has been at your father's side for years. I gave him sleeping powder so I could... The captain looked at Isabel and said, so I could talk to him to find out the truth. John knew what the captain meant to say, and asked if he may be the one to talk to him. The captain agreed. The captain took everyone to the kitchen to have a drink and something to eat. Isabella was the first to enter the kitchen. Mary had her back to the door, busy washing pots, when Isabella said, "My dear Mary, how I have missed you." There was a crash as a pot fell to the floor. Mary spun around, gave a delighted cry of surprise, and rushed over to Isabella, throwing her arms around her, and with tears in her eyes said, "Miss Isabella, I thought I would never see you again. I have been so alone since Lady Margaret died, and you had to leave the house. Then that devil came to the house and... Calm your heart, Mary. Everything is going to be all right now. I am home and so is Edward," replied Isabella. "Master Edward, I have been praying for your safe return. I am so happy that you both are here, and the house will now be a happy place once more," said an excited and emotional Mary. John stepped forward to greet Mary. She looked at John and burst into tears, pulling John into her arms and said, "My dear John, my heart was broken when you left, and every day I have thought about you, and wished I had the courage years ago to tell you I love you." Mary stopped when she realized what she had just said, and with an embarrassed look on her face, stepped away. John didn't say a word. He just pulled Mary into his arms and said, "I have always loved you, Mary, but was afraid if I told you my feelings you would reject me." The professor smiled and started to laugh, then said, "The great fearless John, who never runs from danger but runs into it, is afraid of love. Now I know John's weakness, Mary and love." That remark made everyone laugh, especially John and Mary. They all sat down to eat. There was much to talk about and stories to tell. The captain asked if anyone wanted to have coffee from Colombia. Edward's coffee, the captain added, which made them all laugh and said yes. The captain walked over to the storeroom to fetch a box of coffee. As he was looking around for the coffee, he noticed a wicker basket full of dried herbs and various mushrooms. He found the coffee, took it into the kitchen, and prepared the coffee grinder. Mary said she would help the captain, as it's not an easy coffee grinder to use. The captain leaned over to Mary and said in a low voice, "I noticed you have a lot of dried herbs and mushrooms in your store, Mary." Without looking, Mary said, "Yes, it is best to collect as much as you can this time of year. It is always better if you dry them in the spring and autumn." The captain gave a little smile and said, "How did you find out, Mary?" While everyone was talking and eating, Mary asked the captain to help her carry some vegetables from the garden. Mary and the captain were in the garden collecting a few vegetables and placing them in the baskets, when the captain asked Mary again, "How did you know?" Mary stopped what she was doing, stood up, and with a heart full of hatred and anger in her voice said, "I found out what happened to Lady Margaret and Edward's mother, as well as that devil's first wife," snapped an angry Mary. "But how did you manage to find all this out, Mary?" asked the captain. "It was a few months ago. Pete Turnbull was in the kitchen after one of those devil's dinner parties had finished. He'd been drinking a lot and was too drunk to make his way to his room, but before the butler came to help me with him, Turnbull was talking to himself, and he said that he was tired from having all this blood on his hands. I was shocked to hear him say that, so I asked who died. He started talking again and said he did not want to kill Lowing's wife as she was kind to him, but he had no choice as Lowings had evidence on Turnbull that could have him hanged. Then, when he said that Lady Margaret was going to be his last death, he was tired of doing Lowing's dirty work. When I heard that my heart was so full of anger and hatred for that man Arthur Lowings, I decided to slowly poison his mind with my special dried herbs and mushrooms. I wanted justice for Lady Margaret. So now I understand why he was forgetting things and then seeing the visions," said the captain. "Yes, but when Turnbull was drunk again, he talked a lot about how Lowings is like his father he never had, because he wanted his son Edward dead, just like Turnbull killed his grandfather. I knew I had to mix more and more of my dried herbs and mushrooms into his food," replied Mary. The captain sat on the edge of a wheelbarrow and just looked to the sky, smiling and shaking his head, then said, "Mary, there have been many people involved in trying to bring that man to justice, from everyone in the kitchen to the Prime Minister and the palace, and all the while we were trying to find ways to do that. You took justice into your own hands by being the judge, the jury, and the punisher. There is one thing. I have to ask Mary when you saw me with Sir Arthur. You didn't say anything or give anything away that you knew me, which I am very grateful for," said the captain. "Sir, Lady Margaret trusted you completely, and so that was good enough for me," replied Mary. The captain was about to stand up when he said, "Mary, I had the same meal a few times that you served Lowings. How is it that I did not notice anything strange in my behavior?" Mary smiled and said, "Everything I served you was just normal mushrooms and herbs." Then Mary's face changed and she said, "Will I have to go to prison now?" The captain smiled and said, "No, Mary, this is just between us. Let's just leave it at that." It was late afternoon when John said, "I think it's time I paid Turnbull a visit." The professor looked up from the table and said, "I think it is best if you stay here, John. Otto and I will go to talk to Turnbull. You have too many emotions in your heart to talk to him." "He's right," said the captain. "You may let your emotions get the better of you." John sat back down and realized they were right. He would probably do something rash. Both the professor and Otto left the room to see Turnbull in the study, taking some food and drink with them. Once inside the study, Turnbull was sitting up and fully awake. "It is safe to untie him for now, Otto." Turnbull put his hands on the table and started to eat. Both men could see he was hungry, but scared at the same time. "Well, Turnbull, what have you got yourself into this time?" asked the professor. "You already know or have a good idea, Professor," said Turnbull with a look of guilt on his face. Otto looked at the professor and said, "Do you know each other?" "Turnbull and I go back a long way with our dealings at the docks. Only Turnbull was always in the shadows, getting others to do his dirty work," replied the professor. The professor and Otto sat down opposite Turnbull, but before they could say anything, Turnbull looked up and said, "It's okay. I know my time is up, and I will have to pay for what I have done." Otto was about to ask a question when Turnbull looked at Otto. "It is okay. You don't have to try to make me talk. I will tell you everything." Otto looked at the professor and said, "I have never seen a man so completely defeated that he has just given up." The professor understood and just nodded to Turnbull, who then started to talk from the beginning about his involvement with Sir Arthur Lowings. It was about 2 hours before Otto left the study to join the others in the parlour. "Well, what has he said?" asked John. "The professor asked me to tell you all. He will let you know everything when he returns," replied Otto. "Where has he gone and why?" asked Isabella. "I only know that Turnbull and the professor went to the estate church." On hearing that, Mary and Isabella were angry until the captain said, "Calm yourselves, ladies. I believe I know the reason, and it's for a very good reason." On hearing that, they both sat down, knowing everything was going to be all right. The professor returned an hour later, but before anyone could say anything, he gave the captain a bundle of letters and documents. "Those are Turnbull's keep-out-of-jail documents. Everything he and Lowings have done over the years, including payments made to members of Parliament and the Bank of England, to name but a few." "Why did he just give them to you?" asked Isabella. "He gave them up because he knows he will hang on the gallows, and he has made peace with himself while we were in the church getting those documents. Now, Edward, I know you want to know about your mother, but Turnbull had nothing to do with that. He only made sure that once he knew someone was inquiring about Lady Margaret's death, he was ordered by your father to tie up any loose ends, and that was Corporal Thompson, who was a frequent visitor at the opium den. Turnbull had given him pure opium which killed him. So it was all my father's doing to have my mother killed," said Edward in a half-emotional, half-angry voice. "Yes, and he had the Member of Parliament killed, so he could take his place. He did kill his first wife to marry your mother," replied the professor. "Was this Thompson responsible for my mother's death?" asked Edward. "Everything points to him being the one who was involved." On hearing that Edward sat back in the chair, Isabella sat with him trying to comfort him, when the captain said, "We need to get Turnbull to Newgate tonight." John and Otto said they would take him by using the covered 2-horse-drawn carriage and return in the morning. The captain said, "Stay at the hotel. Just tell them at the reception I said it was okay. And anyway, they know you both well. You have been there enough times," laughed the captain. Both John and Otto left for London with Turnbull within the hour. The next day at Oakfield, everyone was busy cleaning and sorting out the room damaged by the fire. When John arrived at the house, he spoke to the captain and passed him a letter. He then proceeded to open it, then called Edward over, then told Edward that the institution where his father was being held needed a relative to visit them to discuss personal matters. Edward said nothing. He just felt anger inside his heart. Everyone went down to lunch. Mary had prepared a special meal. The captain took one look at the meals prepared, gave a chuckle, and smiled. "What has made you laugh so?" asked the professor. "I was just thinking of the dinners I had when Lowings was here," replied the captain. Isabella sat down at the table and saw the food. She clapped her hands and said to Mary, "My favourite meal. It has been so long since I tasted mushrooms and herbs, potatoes with lamb chops and the gravy. Oh, how I have missed your wonderful gravy, Mary." "I knew you would enjoy it. Did you know the captain likes it too? And I think it is his favourite now as well," replied Mary, who then turned towards the captain, then gave him a cheeky grin and a wink. This made the captain burst out laughing, knowing exactly what Mary meant. It has now been over a month since Isabella and Edward arrived back at Oakfield Manor. The captain has been busy collecting evidence against the remaining few who were in Sir Arthur's Gentlemen's Club and are now locked away in Newgate Prison with the rest of the club, where they will remain until the palace decides their fate. Pete Turnbull was sent to the gallows inside Newgate Prison. It was thought best to have the execution inside the courtyard instead of the normal public execution outside Newgate walls. Isabella, with the help of Carl and the captain, returned all the land to everyone Sir Arthur had taken from them as part of his get-rich scheme for sand or shingle in Norfolk. Edward walked into the study and told John and Isabella that he was ready to confront his father. "I am ready to face him without anger or rage for now, but I cannot guarantee how I will be once I see him." "Are you sure, husband? I know it has not been easy for you." "Yes, my love, I am ready. John, could you help me prepare the carriage? I would like to leave within the hour." "Yes, Edward, and in fact I would like to go with you if I may." "Yes, of course, John," replied Edward. Edward, Isabella and John arrived at Our Lady of Light Institution. Once they entered the main door, they were greeted by Dr. James Howard. "Good morning, and welcome to Our Lady of Light. May I ask what brings you here on this fine day?" "I am here regarding Arthur Lowings," replied Edward. The doctor's face changed as soon as he heard the name Arthur Lowings. "Please follow me to my office, where we can talk and discuss what is to be done." Upon entering the room, they sat down, and Edward introduced everyone. "This is my wife, Isabella, our friend John, and I am Edward Lowings, Arthur Lowings' son. I am here regarding some paperwork." Dr. Howard pulled a large folder from a cabinet, placed it on the desk, and began to find the section on Arthur Lowings. "Here we are. This is a strange case of the mind and one that needs more study." "Why do you say that?" asked Edward. "Well, there have been times your father showed signs of being normal, and that gives the impression he is getting better at controlling his mind. Then there are times he thinks he is a Greek god, and even God himself. He talks and argues with people who are not there. Then at times, something triggers him to be completely normal as you and I," replied the doctor. Edward was listening and not listening. He was thinking of his mother and why his so-called father wanted her dead. "I think if your father saw you, he may remember, and that may help him to control the mind," said the doctor. At that moment, a nurse rushed in and shouted, "It's happened again, and it's bad." The doctor said to Edward, "I think you had better come with me." Edward asked John to stay with Isabella and then followed the doctor to the common room. They were greeted with a scene that could have been from a comedy play. Inmates were running everywhere, some swinging on the curtains and others hiding under the tables, some throwing chairs and even each other. And there by a door, an orderly was holding his hand to his eye, with blood pouring down his face. The scene looked like it was right out of a tragic Shakespeare play. Edward followed the doctor to the door, and the doctor told other orderlies to help the man to the medical room and get the doctor to attend to him. "He was stabbed in the eye with a pen," said one man. The doctor unlocked the door and went in, telling Edward to be careful and don't say or do anything to aggravate his father. The room was like any other room you would expect in a large country house. Apart from there was a large chair, a small wooden one, a bed with straps on each corner, and one window that had large metal bars across it. The window was not like a normal window. The glass was so thick it only let the daylight into the room, but impossible to see what is outside. Standing by the wall in the far corner was Edward's father. At that moment, Edward realized he felt nothing, no emotion, and no love for his father. The doctor moved forward and asked him to sit down on his large chair. "I have someone to see you." Edward stepped forward, and his father looked up, and in an instant, the look on his face changed, then said, "Edward, when did you get back from the Americas? Did you make your fortune?" Then a strange look came over his face. It was a look of fear and disbelief at the same time. He then said, "How is this possible? You are dead. You died in the Caribbean. I had you killed." Then a look of real fear came all over his face. "Keep away from me. You are just like that stubborn old woman. Leave me alone. You are all dead. Dead. You are not real." Then just as fast as the outburst happened, Sir Arthur was back to normal. "Edward, it is time you got married. I have the perfect match for you with Lord Kemp's daughter. We can make a lot of money out of the marriage." At that moment, John and Isabella were outside the room. Edward turned to fetch Isabella. "This is my wife, Isabella." A look of horror came over Sir Arthur's face. He looked at Isabella and said, "You? Why are you with my son? You are only a maid, a servant to that Lady Margaret. Edward, get rid of her. If you want her that much, you can just take her when you want. You don't have to marry her." Edward had to hold back his temper when Isabella stepped forward, looked Sir Arthur in the eye and said, "We were married before Edward arrived in England from the Americas. We are perfect for each other because we have a love, and it is an unbreakable bond, and that is something you are incapable of. The only thing you loved is money and power. Oh, I do apologize. Where are my manners? Please allow me to introduce myself. I am Lady Isabella of Oakfield Manor, or you can call me Lady Isabella Lowings, wife to your son Edward, and one day a mother to your grandchildren." Edward took Isabella by the hand and turned to leave the room. As the door was closing, they heard Edward's father call out, "I want to go home. We can be a family." They returned to the office, and Edward signed a document that was for one Arthur Lowings, of an unsound mind, is to spend the rest of his life at the institution, and he is to receive any treatment new or old in the help of understanding the human brain. As Edward, Isabella and John were about to leave, Isabella noticed a portrait on the wall and asked, "Doctor, why is there a portrait of Lady Margaret on the wall?" "Oh, Lady Margaret was the Institute's benefactor. She founded the Institute after her brother died, originally for any military men who were suffering from the horrors of war," replied the doctor. "We were sad to hear of her sudden death." "Then I will carry on with Lady Margaret's work and make sure this place is provided for in the years that come," replied Isabella. The doctor thanked Isabella for her kind generosity. As the three started their journey home, John said what they were all thinking. "Fate has a strange and twisted way of serving justice. Lady Margaret, even from the grave, has dealt her justice." "Unexpected justice," replied Isabella. Edward felt as if a large weight had been lifted off his chest. He took hold of Isabella's hand and said, "Let's go home."
I just wanna love you, just wanna hold you, just wanna be with you till we grow old. Please tell me you'll stay or take me away. I want you for myself every single day.
George the doorman and his family were given Edward's mother's house, where he had been a doorman for over 30 years. George was given a very good yearly pension. Both he and his wife lived many happy years together there until they both passed away 6 months apart in 1911, aged 82 and 78. Lord Kemp became a Member of Parliament, replacing Edward's father in June 1886 until 1888, when he had a riding accident on his estate in Surrey. He remained in a wheelchair until he died in 1905. Edward's and Charlie's uncle Carl continued to serve as the German advisor to the palace until 1902. He died at home in Germany in 1913, aged 94. Otto continued to work as the German ambassador to South America until 1889, when he married Lord Kemp's daughter. They lived on Lord Kemp's estate, with Otto becoming the estate manager. They had 3 children, 1 girl and 2 boys. Otto passed away in his sleep in December 1938, aged 78. Charlie Lowings lived a happy life with his wife and 2 daughters. He took over his father-in-law's export and import business, including looking after Edward's coffee trade with Colombia. He died peacefully in his bed, surrounded by his family, in 1953, aged 98. The professor was given a commission by the palace and continued to work alongside the captain, working to keep Britain safe. The professor, Edward, John and Otto had a strong bond of friendship and were always there for each other over the years. No one knew much about the professor or his past, not even the captain, but all who knew him could trust him no matter what. The professor had one passion he discovered later in life, and that was to fly, especially if there were any new aeroplanes. He would even go on test flights. The last anyone saw of the professor was on a new plane designed to carry airmail letters. The test flight was on the 1st of September 1939, while flying over Poland. It is presumed his plane was shot down. He was 91 years old. John and Mary married in May 1886, 2 days before John took up the position as Sir John, Governor of Jamaica. They didn't have any children of their own, but they adopted 3 local Jamaican children, 2 girls and 1 boy. Edward and Isabella visited them often over the years. John died in Mary's arms from dengue fever in 1912, aged 70. Mary continued to live in Jamaica and worked as a governess to the ambassador's children. Mary never revealed even to John that it was her special mushroom and herbs that started Sir Arthur's mind going crazy. She had been adding them to his food for months after she found out Sir Arthur had Lady Margaret killed. Mary passed away in 1925, aged 78, and was buried alongside her beloved John in Jamaica, a place they loved deeply. Sir Arthur Lowings spent the rest of his days in the Institute after Edward signed a no-release. The special mushrooms and herbs Mary had given him in his food for almost a year did enough damage to his mind that he is classed as unstably insane. There are days when Sir Arthur is not shouting at someone who is not there or trying to kill anyone near him. He just sits and talks to himself as if he is in a conversation with Edward, Charlie, their mother, and even George the doorman. Edward did visit his father once more, and it was the same thing. When did Edward get back from the Americas, and had he made his fortune yet? In Edward's heart, he knew it was right to make his father suffer as he did with Charlie and himself by killing their mother, his first wife, Lady Margaret, and how many others. Sir Arthur died in 1909, aged 83. He choked on his tongue when he cut it in half and tried to swallow it. He is buried in a corner of the gardens on the institution grounds with an iron marker for a headstone. No name, only a number. The captain carried on his work for the British government and the palace, working with the professor for many years. In that time, the captain had saved many lives and solved many cases of corruption, not just in England, but for other governments around the world. The captain took his last voyage in April 1912 on board the RMS Titanic when he was 86. The hotel suite the captain used for years is still called the Captain's Suite. Edward and Isabella lived a happy life, one that was full of love. They had 4 children, 1 girl and 3 boys. Their daughter, who was the eldest, was named after Lady Margaret, and later in life she became the new Lady Margaret of Oakfield Manor. The eldest son was called Davies after the professor, who saved Edward's life when they were in Jamaica. Davies became a doctor and worked in a children's hospital in London. The next eldest son was called John, who became an officer in the British Army and was killed in action on the First Battle of the Somme in 1916. The youngest son was called William, after the captain, whose real name was William Waterman. He followed in the captain's footsteps and worked for the palace and the British government, gathering information that could harm Britain. Edward and Isabella travelled a lot, going to Jamaica to visit John and Mary, and to Colombia to visit Edward's friends and to see Otto. Edward built a memorial to his mother in the garden near the house, and another one for Lady Margaret. For many years, Edward and Isabella helped anyone who needed it. They built new houses for the people who worked on the estate, had all the restoration work done on the local church as well, and repaired any houses in the village. It was decided between Edward and Isabella that it is only fair that Charlie's 2 daughters should have Edward and Charlie's mother's estate in Germany. Oakfield was a happy home, as Lady Margaret always wanted it to be, especially when Isabella was a young child, and now it is a happy home to 4 children. Edward and Isabella lived a happy marriage full of love for 66 years. Edward died the day after his and Isabella's anniversary in April of 1951, aged 91. Isabella died 2 days later, some say from a broken heart. Isabella was 86. They were buried together in a newly built mausoleum on the estate, erected by their daughter, the new Lady Margaret of Oakfield Manor. There is an inscription above the door in Latin which reads, "Indissolubile vinculum, Unbreakable Bond." Unbreakable Bond is a unique tale crafted by the creator of Unconditional Love videos, David J. All main characters within this story are entirely fictitious, while certain locations and events are based on reality. Thank you for tuning in.
You say